Welcome to A Cozy Crime Story. Tonight we are diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime, real stories of mysteries, betrayal, and cold-blooded crime, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. The first thing people whispered about wasn't the accident. It wasn't the crushed running shoes left on the roadside, or the silence that settled over Dmitry Koep's home like a heavy lid. No, what seized the town's breath was the shock that followed. Exactly 14 days later, Dmitry married his late wife's best friend. 2 weeks after Corley's life was taken by a hit and run, Dmitry stood inside a clerk's office, signing a marriage certificate with hands that trembled so hard the pen nearly slipped. The clerk watched politely. Marilee Purdy stood beside him, steady but pale, and in that moment, anyone who saw them would have wondered the same thing. How does a man move from loss to a new vow in the span of days? But what the town never saw was what happened right before Dmitry stepped up to that counter. He stared at the certificate, as if it were an accusation. His jaw tightened, his pulse thumped in his ears, and for a brief second, he almost walked out. Not because he didn't care for Marilee, not because he was confused, but because grief can twist time in strange ways, turning days into years and years into a single long minute. And still, he signed. A man whose world had collapsed without warning placed his name beside another woman's in ink that looked too bold, too final. People outside that office had no idea what pushed him to do it. They didn't know about the promise tucked inside an envelope sealed long before the tragedy. They didn't know about the confession waiting like a quiet weight in Marilee's pocket. All the town saw was a man moving on too quickly. All the town cared about was the rumor that something wasn't right. But you and I? We're about to see the part no one else witnessed. The marriage certificate lay on the desk like an object pulled from another life. Too clean, too official, too calm for the man staring at it. Dmitry's fingers hovered above the paper, shaking in a way he couldn't control. It wasn't nerves, it wasn't excitement. It was something raw, something carved out of the weight he carried in his chest since the morning Corley didn't come home. The room felt strangely still. The clock ticked in stiff little clicks. A pen rolled slightly against the wooden tray, nudged by nothing more than a faint draft from the hallway. Marilee stood beside him, breathing quietly, hands folded against her stomach as if she feared they might betray her thoughts. She didn't try to touch him. She didn't speak. She simply waited, because she knew this wasn't a moment that could be hurried. Dmitry lowered his gaze again, staring at the place where his signature would go. His name, the same name he had signed on his wedding license with Coralie, now demanded to be written again, only inches from someone else's. He swallowed hard. The ink in the pen glistened as if it expected an answer. What the clerk could not see, what the townspeople could never imagine, was that this moment wasn't born from sudden affection or impulse. This moment started long before the accident, long before the phone call, long before the world shifted beneath Dmitry's feet. It began with a letter sealed months earlier, its contents unknown to him until after the funeral. A letter that would explain why he now stood frozen between memory and a new beginning he hadn't asked for. He tightened his grip on the pen. The paper waited. Let me ask you something, because before we go any further, this story isn't just about Dmitry. It's about anyone who has ever loved deeply, lost deeply, or tried to make sense of life when the ground shifts without warning. How long does a heart supposedly wait before it stops drowning and tries to breathe again? Is there a calendar for grief, a rule book that says what's acceptable and what's shameful? And here's another question. If someone you adored gave you permission to keep living fully, would you honor that, or would guilt crush the chance before it even began? Most people think they know what they do until they face the moment themselves. What would you do if the person who knew you best left behind a request that didn't match what the world believes is proper? Or would you let fear shape the rest of your life? And consider this. When you experience a loss so heavy it knocks the breath out of your ribs, who do you turn to? A casual acquaintance? Or the one person who knew the part of your life that you're terrified of losing forever? Dmitri didn't choose comfort out of convenience. He didn't reach for the closest presence. He gravitated toward the one person who loved Coralie almost as fiercely as he did. So before we judge him, we have to ask ourselves, is grief always clean? Or can it pull two wounded people toward each other in ways neither planned? These questions lingered around Dmitri long before the gossip began. The trouble wasn't simply that Dmitri remarried quickly. The trouble was how fast small towns notice everything, and how quickly those observations turn sharp. By the time Dmitri and Marilee left the clerk's office, whispers had already begun drifting through grocery aisles, barbershops, and porch gatherings. People lowered their voices as if the lowered volume softened the judgment. 2 weeks? That's not grief, that's something else. She was her best friend. It doesn't sit right. The town didn't need facts. It needed a story that made sense to its own expectations. And the story they chose was a simple one. Someone must have crossed a line. Some insisted Dmitri had been unfaithful. Others insisted Marilee had been waiting in the background. A few suggested the hit and run was too convenient, hinting at motives that had no foundation in reality. But gossip rarely cares about evidence, only the thrill of suspicion. What truly fueled the tension wasn't jealousy or cruelty. It was confusion. People didn't understand how grief could twist someone's choices so tightly, so quickly. They didn't understand that silence between two hurting people can become a kind of shelter. They couldn't see the weight of Coralie's letter or the promise it carried. And soon enough, that confusion hardened into certainty. This marriage wasn't right. Something had to be hidden. Something felt out of place. The town clung to its assumptions as if they were facts, unaware that the truth behind Dmitri's decision wasn't scandal, but a message written long before tragedy struck. Here's the part the town never knew, the part that turns every accusation on its head, because beneath the quick marriage, beneath the rumors and side glances, there were forces at play no one had the courage to imagine. Dmitri didn't wake up one morning and choose to forget Coralie. He didn't sign that certificate out of weakness. The truth began months earlier, hidden inside a carefully sealed envelope. Coralie wrote it long before the accident, long before her final morning jog. Her handwriting carried the same warmth she lived by, and inside that envelope, she planted the seed of a request Dmitri wasn't ready to face until after she was gone. But that wasn't the only secret. There was the second letter, the one she gave to Marilee, the one Marilee kept close, tucked away like something precious and painful at the same time. The letter Dmitri hadn't read, and wouldn't read for a long while. And there was more. The hit and run that shattered Dmitri's life wasn't as simple as the town assumed. People believed it to be chance, a tragic collision nobody could have predicted, but certain details were never shared publicly. A witness noticed something odd and didn't speak up. A driver fled the scene with panic guiding every move. A decision made in fear set off a chain of consequences that touched lives far beyond that single road. So before we continue, ask yourself, what if the truth behind Dmitri's choice wasn't betrayal, but a promise? What if the hit and run wasn't random, but connected to a much larger reckoning? We're just getting started, and the real story begins now. Before we unravel the rest of this emotional mystery, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this. The town settled itself against the river like a hand cupping something small and warm. People moved at a measured pace here. Post office clocks clicked the hours more gently, porches filled with slow conversation at dusk, and the bakery window fogged each morning with the steam of fresh bread. There was a comfort to that cadence, the sense that life arranged itself into repeating patterns where each neighbor played a small, reliable part. On Hollow Street, lives overlapped the way book pages overlap in a well-used novel. Shopkeepers nodded at the same customers each day. The grocer knew which apples would be chosen for pies and which for eating straight. Children learned to pedal on the same cracked sidewalks their parents had used when they were young. Windowsills bore potted thyme and chives, and every spring someone displayed a new row of painted stones, little markers of belonging. The seasons were not dramatic here. They arrived with modesty. and the town adjusted in equal measure. Dmitri fit into that pace as naturally as he fit into his hands-on work. He rose at the first light most mornings, the lamps still soft in the kitchen, and he liked the small tasks that started the day, sweeping the workshop floor, checking the radio for the weather, joking stiffly with the barista who knew his coffee order by heart. Coralie moved through the town with a different kind of presence, bright, focused, and quietly authoritative. She knew exactly when to recommend an arrangement or when to stop and listen to a customer's story. Together, they were part of the town's rhythm, reliable in a way that made people feel steadier just by watching them. Evenings felt like a reward. Windows glowed, and families drifted to porches or small dining rooms. The golden light softened features. Neighbors sized up each other's days in small waves of conversation. It was the sort of place where a missing person was noticed, not because someone announced it, but because someone's usual place at the bakery remained empty. That absence did not go unnoticed. It lodged like a small stone in the ribs of people who paid attention to ordinary patterns. This was the backdrop of their lives, a place that gave shape to small mercies and ordinary consolations. It was the ordinary that made the coming rupture so painful. When the pattern broke, everyone felt the tug, and the town's steady pulse faltered. Their home looked lived in without being cluttered, objects placed with quiet intention. A pair of mismatched mugs sat by the sink, a wooden spoon darkened at the handle from years of stirring. A single pair of gardening gloves hung near the back door. Those small, ordinary things marked the rhythm of their days and told the story of a life built out of particular comforts. Dmitri's mornings began with a ritual that felt like an unspoken promise. He would fill the kettle, set it to simmer, and move across the kitchen with the sort of competence that belongs to people who have learned to keep a home. Coralie would be at the counter, home delivery flowers spread around her like little explosions of color. She would hum as she trimmed stems. Her hands had a patient steadiness as she tied twine and balanced blooms in jars. They talked in fragments, about weather, about which seed packets to plant first, about the neighbor's cat that had decided the hydrangea was an acceptable throne. Conversation grew into laughter, then into shared silence that felt comfortable rather than stalled. On weekends, they would take Lumen down to the river path, with Coralie carrying a small canvas bag of clippers and ribbons, always ready to bring back an odd sprig to tuck into an arrangement. Dmitri would point out a crooked board on the path or the best place to sit and watch water spill over rocks. They liked small competitions, who could identify the most birds, who could find the oddest pebble. At home, evenings often involved dinner made simply but well, roasted root vegetables, bread that was slightly chewy, a salad of whatever greens the garden decided to give them. Coralie read aloud sometimes from a paperback, the sentences breaking into laughter at intervals, her voice warming up the room like someone lighting a lamp. They were careful with each other in the way quiet people become careful, holding doors, remembering which neighbor needed a casserole, leaving notes on the counter. Love here was not loud declarations, it was steady attention. Dmitri noticed the way Coralie folded sweaters a certain way, keeping sleeves tucked for less creasing. Coralie noticed the little nicks on his hands and would rub them with balm while he talked about a piece of furniture he planned to fix. It was in those maintenance-like gestures that their devotion lived, practical, attentive, and unshowy. Those routines anchored them, made their world predictable in the best sense. They were the kind of small observances people build their lives around. And because the routines were so ordinary, their absence could later be counted like missing teeth in a smile, purely and entirely noticeable. Sunlight that morning had a particular thinness, the sort that comes at the edge of spring when the sky is clearing after rain. Coralie moved through the house with the quick deliberation she always had when she had an early shift at the shop. She checked the calendar pinned on the refrigerator, smoothed the hem of her jacket, and bent to tie her shoes with a practiced loop. Her movements were efficient but affectionate. She paused to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, glanced at the little vase of daffodils that had been blooming since yesterday, and kissed Dmitri by the door with the lightness that made him smile. "Back for lunch if the shop lets me," she teased with a small grin, a daily joke she had repeated often enough it was nearly a comfort. She waved as she left, the kind of wave that carried an assurance, something like a promise that the ordinary would return. Lumen trotted to the gate, nose pointed, ready for his morning patrol, and Dmitri walked the dog for a moment to see her off. The streets were almost empty, the town still nudging itself awake. Birds argued quietly in the hedges. A delivery bike rattled the corner with a cheerful clink. Coralie's route followed the old road by the school, and then, if she had a little time, down the lane that gave onto the river. She liked to take small detours to notice spring bulbs pushing through soil, or to pick an errant stem for a jar at the shop. Her shoes were solid and worn in, the kind she trusted for morning runs and quick errands. People in town greeted her as she passed, some with a nod, some with a quick exchange about a neighborhood matter, and she returned every greeting with the ease of someone who loved small talk as much as she loved arranging flowers. What made the morning ordinary was not just the routine, but the soft predictability of it. She would be gone an hour and back with stories about a difficult customer, or about a new cultivar she planned to try in the shop. The neighborhood expected her to come back, because she always did. No one could have guessed the sudden tilt that would fold that expectation in half. The morning concluded with that last wave, and a turning of the body that suggested she was carrying the day forward, unaware that later people would try to reconstruct the minute she left the gate, as if mapping those footsteps could return what was lost. Lumen was the sort of dog whose moods read like an honest ledger, pleased, curious, protective. He had a golden coat that shone faintly in light and a patience set to his eyes that made him more companion than pet. People in town saw him trotting beside Coralie and Dmitri and assumed he belonged as much to the street as he did to the household. Children waved, postmen slowed. He was an uncomplicated presence in a community that valued directness. In grief, a dog becomes a living thermometer of household feeling. Lumen was attuned to changes before words could describe them. When mornings were ordinary, he demanded play and pressed his head into knees at breakfast. When silence stretched too long, he would pad from room to room as if checking for the missing warmth of a particular lap or voice. He understood the difference between someone distracted and someone lost in sorrow. After the accident, his behavior shifted in ways that were disarmingly human. He waited at the gate, head cocked, after the time Coralie should have returned. He pressed close to Dmitri in the evenings, forcing a hand to reach down and stroke his fur. The dog's breath, steady and warm, became a small tether for Dmitri when the house seemed to press in on him. Lumen's insistence on routine, demanding walks, nudging the leash toward the door, was a kind of gentle command to live, eat, move, see the light. Dmitri followed those motions at first, because caring for Lumen kept his hands busy and his brain from stepping into the darker places that opened when he sat too still. Neighbors noticed Lumen's confusion before they fully understood the human causes. He would look long at the empty chair where Coralie kept her knitting, or at the doorway she used to come through. Sometimes he would bring a small found object, a twig or a worn shoe sole, and leave it by the kitchen mat as if offering tribute. In the first week, Lumen's patience held the household like a fragile support beam. His presence made people come by, some to check on the dog, others to offer hot food, and those visits layered into the way the town tried to keep grief manageable. Lumen's routines also gave Dmitri a path forward. In the ritual of feeding, brushing, and walking him, Dmitri found a sequence that required no decisions that might feel like betrayals. The dog did not ask moral questions. He asked for food, for movement, for the bones of a day. Those bones were enough to keep Dmitri upright until he could understand what else the world might ask of him. Coralie's florist shop was the kind of place that refused to be ordinary, not because it sought attention, but because it made small moments feel important. The doorbell had a bright tinkling sound that announced customers and lifted spirits, and the interior always smelled of earth green stems and citrus, a clean living smell that felt as if the room itself breathed. Shelves held jars of ribbon, scissors, twine, and an assortment of vessels that had been collected and repurposed. A workbench bore stains from countless stems and petals. It was a surface that remembered the hands that had shaped arrangements there. She arranged flowers with a kind of geometry, balancing weight and color, leaving small spaces where unexpected stems could breathe. Customers loved not only the bouquets but the way Coralie listened. People entered her shop with announcements, confessions, or half-formed worries, and left with something that felt like an answer wrapped in paper. Children sometimes rearranged the display impulsively and were forgiven with a laugh and a tiny posy. The garden at the house was an ongoing experiment. Coralie liked to coax color out of odd corners. Tulips in one bed leaned toward the sun, while a patch of thyme bunched near the stone path that crossed the backyard. Dmitri had made a bench by the arbor, where they would sit on humid evenings, sipping tea and discussing small ambitions like painting the shed or building a new potting table. Composting, pruning, and planting were not chores but conversation starters, and the way they tended the soil became a kind of shared language. Kitchen rituals stitched the day together. Bread kneaded slowly on Sundays, mugs warmed by the sink, spices stored in labeled jars. Coralie's method with herbs was the same steadiness she applied to arrangements. A touch here, a trim there, tasting and adjusting until it felt right. She was fond of little pancakes in a cast-iron pan when it rained, and she kept a drawer of postcards with paint smeared, corners that she'd saved because they made her smile. The kitchen carried memory in its cookware. Every ding of the oven was a small punctuation to their days. These scenes mattered because they were proof of life's texture, the habit, the small joy, the ordinary artistry that makes someone irreplaceable. The shop, garden, and kitchen were repositories for their shared history, the place where promises were unintentionally renewed every morning and where the first loss would later register with painful clarity. They did not make great cinematic gestures on the morning Coralie left, no long torrential goodbye, just a kiss placed on the cheek with familiar tenderness and that habitual wave at the gate. Yet in memory those small acts would grow weight until they bore the full measure of what had been lost. The kiss was the last ordinary warmth he would feel from her for a long while. The wave was the last motion she used to tell him aloud, in motion, that all would be as it had been. Dmitri watched the curve of her hand disappear down the street, and for a moment time behaved like it always had, linear, predictable, the next thing following the last with pleasant inevitability. He folded his hands, leaned on the fence post, and called Lumen back inside, as if to return to morning's usual tasks. The day continued for most of the town. The coffee shop filled, the mail carrier made his rounds, the school bus creaked down Maple Avenue. It was a regular morning, and that regularity made what came next harder to reconcile. Then, in a way that would later haunt the edges of every recollection, there exists a flash that people would remember in fragments. How light hit a particular puddle, the sound of a tire that didn't belong, the way a person on the sidewalk froze, as if listening for something. For now, though, the narrative refuses to give up that image. It will appear again like a small shard, a momentary cut that hints at violence without showing it. The sudden shift from ordinary mourning to something that stops time will come later in our account. For this chapter, it is a quiet note of warning, an omen in the middle of an otherwise mild day. That tonal shift, between the warmth of routine and the coldness of accident, changes the way we measure what came before. Simple acts become testaments, a plate left half-eaten, a sweater folded on a chair, a pair of shoes by the door. The stakes are not only about a life taken, but about how quickly the ordinary can be rewritten and how many small proofs of love can be left behind like pages ripped from a book. So we hold that final kiss and that final wave up to the light and ask, how does a town respond when one of its steady rhythms snaps? The answer will come in ripples, some generous, some cruel. For now, those tiny gestures are all Dmitri has to keep Coralie present in his daily life, and they become the quiet, aching anchors of everything that follows. The call came at 9:17 a.m. Dmitri remembered the exact minute because everything beyond that number felt broken, like glass scattered across a kitchen floor. He had just put tools on the bench in the workshop, preparing to sand a cabinet door, when the phone vibrated against the wood. The sound was sharp, impatient, unlike the usual mid-morning notes from customers or neighbors. He answered with the absent tone of someone expecting routine. Instead, he stepped into a moment that did not belong to his life. A neighbor's voice filled the line first, but the words didn't land correctly. They came out in jagged bursts, as if someone were speaking while trying to breathe underwater. Dmitri kept saying, slow down, but the voice only shook harder. He could make out his wife's name, then something about the road near the school, then a phrase that scraped across his spine. Hit. She fell, not moving. He felt his stomach fold. The workshop suddenly sounded too loud. Saws, clamps, wood dust shifting, everything wrong and out of place. Before he could form a single question, a second voice took over the call. A police officer, steady but heavy, asking if he was Coralie Renner's husband. Dmitri said yes, though his voice didn't sound like his own. The officer didn't raise his tone. He didn't dramatize anything. He simply delivered truth in a way that made Dmitri's knees lock. There was an accident. A vehicle struck her while she was jogging. Emergency services arrived immediately, but she didn't survive her injuries. The word didn't carve straight through him. He gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles whitening. He heard a metallic ring, like something falling to the floor, though nothing had moved. His ears filled with a low hum that drowned the rest of the officer's explanation. Whether the driver was still there, whether someone tried CPR, whether anyone saw the license plate, he couldn't absorb it. He tried to speak. His throat closed. His breath shortened. He stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear while the world tilted without warning. The officer asked if someone was with him. Dmitri shook his head even though no one could see. He tried to answer, but the hum in his ears grew so loud he thought he might black out. All he could manage was a strained whisper, "I'm coming." He left the workshop door open behind him. He didn't grab a jacket or turn off the lights. He barely remembered locking the house. Later that night, someone brought the tools inside for him. The first of many things others would do because Dmitri's mind was not functioning in straight lines anymore. He made it to the road where she lay, but not in time to see her face, not in time to hold her hand before it cooled, only in time to feel the world rearrange itself into a shape he no longer recognized. The human mind has strange ways of protecting itself. Dmitri discovered that as he stood on the side of the road, staring at a sheet pulled too carefully over the body he knew was his wife's. The emergency lights flashed rhythmically, but his eyes refused to focus on anything directly. Faces blurred, the air thickened, sound became distorted. He remembered inhaling but not exhaling. He remembered speaking but not hearing himself. He remembered someone guiding him toward the curb, but the ground felt miles below his shoes. A paramedic asked him questions. Did she leave home at her usual time? Has she been healthy? Do you need someone to call? He answered automatically, as though reading from lines he didn't remember learning. At one point, he blinked, and the scene didn't feel real. It felt like he was watching another man, a man shaped like him, moving stiffly through an unspeakable moment. The tunnel vision hit next. It closed in slowly, like heavy curtains being drawn across his eyes. He could see the sheet, the smeared tire marks on the road, the glove one of the responders had dropped. He could see Lumen's leash still looped around his wrist from the hurried walk out the door. But everything beyond those details dimmed. Voices around him became static, a faint buzzing that made it impossible to distinguish words. People tried to be kind, but their kindness sounded far away. Someone offered him water. Someone offered to call a friend. Someone asked if he wanted to sit in a car until he felt steadier. He didn't feel steadier. He felt hollow, like someone had scooped his center out and left the shell standing upright only because gravity insisted on it. At some point, an officer attempted to describe the vehicle. A sedan, light-colored, slight damage to the front. Witnesses thought it might have hesitated for a second before speeding away. Dmitri heard only fragments, not because he wasn't listening, but because his brain rejected everything except the single fact that mattered. Coralie was gone. He sat on the curb without noticing when his legs folded beneath him. His hands trembled. His fingertips tingled with cold. A blanket was draped around his shoulders before he registered that anyone had approached him. He didn't protest. He didn't thank them. He simply stayed still. Someone asked if he wanted to see her, if he was prepared to. There is no preparation for that moment. He forced himself to stand. Each step toward the still form under the sheet felt like walking deeper into a place where time had cracked open. He knelt beside her, though he couldn't bring himself to lift the covering. He placed his hand near hers, inches away but not touching, because touching meant accepting. He whispered her name once, only once, and when silence answered him, the world lost its shape. Back at the house, absence greeted him louder than any voice ever could. The front door creaked the way it always did, but instead of sounding familiar, it felt intrusive. The air inside the home carried her scent, earthy from the shop, mixed with the soft floral lotion she used. Dmitri stepped inside as if entering a museum of his own life, taking in each object as though it belonged to someone who had left permanently. Her jacket still hung on the hook near the door. Her mug sat on the counter with a faint ring of coffee drying along the rim. A pair of gardening shears rested beside a small pile of clippings she planned to compost. None of these things had changed, yet everything had. He found himself touching her shoes by the mat, brushing his fingers across the laces she had tied only hours earlier. He stared at her open notebook on the table, where she had written the words "order more ranunculus" in quick loops that looked alive. Seeing her, handwriting felt sharper than seeing the sheet on the road. It was immediate, it was intimate, it was her, alive in intention but absent in reality. He moved through the living room like someone walking through a dream they fear waking from. A half-folded blanket on the sofa, a stack of postcards she meant to send, a tiny smudge of green paint on the side of a vase she'd repurposed. Each item confronted him with a sudden, piercing truth. Her life was still here, but she was not. He went into the bedroom and stopped so abruptly that Lumen bumped into his leg. Her sweater lay across the bed, one sleeve slightly curled as if her arm had just slipped out of it. Dmitri pressed his face into the fabric, breathing in whatever remained of her. Tears finally came, not dramatic, not loud, just steady, unstoppable. Night fell without asking his permission. People came by, brought food, left notes, offered prayers. He sat at the table nodding at words that didn't reach him, and when the house emptied again, he stared at the lamp on the nightstand. Her lamp, its warm light stretching across her pillow. He reached for it, turned it off, and whispered, "Good night, love," out of habit. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like another blow. The funeral arrived too quickly, though Dmitri had no sense of days passing. He stood in a black jacket he didn't remember choosing, surrounded by people who looked at him with cautious grief. The service was held in the community chapel, a modest space that Coralie had always liked because it felt welcoming rather than grand. Flowers filled the room, arrangements designed by her colleagues, each one shaped with trembling care. Their colors were soft whites, soft blues, pale yellows. When Dmitri stepped inside, the scent lifted memories so sharply he had to steady himself against a pew. People approached him in a slow procession, offering condolences that blurred together. She was loved. She brought beauty to this town. She had a gentle soul. He nodded. He thanked them. He barely felt the pressure of their hands on his shoulders. Coralie's father stood near the front, eyes rimmed red, clutching a folded handkerchief. Her mother wept quietly beside him. Marily remained close, helping guide guests, handing tissues to those who needed them. She didn't push herself into Dmitri's space, but she never drifted far either. During the service, a family friend spoke of Coralie's kindness, her love for arranging blooms, her way of making people feel seen. Another friend read a poem about seasons changing, one that made Dmitri close his eyes because the words struck too deep. When it came time for him to speak, Dmitri walked to the podium with steps that felt weightless, as if the ground were no longer dependable. He didn't have a prepared speech. He simply said, "She made everything better," and the room understood that was all he could bear to say. At the burial site, the sound of dirt falling on the lowered casket was the most painful sound Dmitri had ever heard. It was final, concrete, impossible to soften. Lumen sat quietly beside him, head lowered as if he understood. Afterward, people gathered near tables filled with food they hoped he might eat. Conversation stayed soft, as though noise itself would cause harm. Dmitri accepted a cup of tea he didn't drink. He allowed hugs he didn't feel. He watched hands he recognized place food on plates he did not touch. As the crowd thinned, Marily came to his side. She didn't speak. She simply rested her hand on his arm long enough to remind him that he wasn't standing alone in a field of sorrow. But later, when he returned home and found the house waiting in stillness, all comfort dissolved. The air held her memory too sharply, the sweater, the mug, the unfinished arrangement on the counter. The world outside continued to turn, but his own world had stopped on a road near the school where her life had been taken in a moment he still did not understand. Grief spreads in small communities like a quiet, heavy fog. It settles into conversations at the grocery store, lingers in the bakery line, and colors every greeting with softened voices. People in town mourned Coralie sincerely. They spoke of her kindness, her attentiveness, the way she brought comfort through flowers. But beneath their sympathy, another feeling began to take shape, confusion mixed with unease. Some residents couldn't stop discussing the details of the accident. Why would a driver flee, especially in a town where everyone knows everyone? Was the car from out of town? Did the witnesses truly see what they thought they saw? That last question was a seed, a small one, planted by an offhand comment from a bystander. A woman who lived near the school mentioned to a neighbor that before the collision, she heard something curious, something like a sharp metallic sound, not from the car itself, but from farther up the road. She couldn't place it. She couldn't explain it. She only said it didn't match the rest of what she saw. The remark drifted through conversations like a tiny ripple, never fully examined, never dismissed. A puzzle piece no one could fit yet. Meanwhile, Dmitri remained unaware of the speculation. He spent his days trying to complete simple tasks, feeding Lumen, answering a few messages, sitting for long stretches without moving. People visited, some offering comfort, others offering theories he couldn't absorb. The world spoke words he wasn't ready to hear. As the second week approached, the sympathy in town shifted. People still cared, but curiosity began to shape their tone. They whispered about how quiet the investigation seemed. They debated whether the driver had been young, inexperienced, or frightened. A handful suggested it was someone local who panicked and ran. Dmitri heard none of it clearly. His mind was wrapped in cotton, his heart in splinters. And yet, the question lingered in the background. Why did the driver flee? A question that would not find an answer until much later. Before we continue, pause for a moment. What would you do in Dmitri's situation? Comment below, and let's continue. The days after the funeral were hazy, thick with emotions Dmitri could not sort or name. Time moved forward without his consent, and yet every hour felt stalled, weighted down by a silence too dense for breathing. He tried to perform daily tasks the way he always had, but everything seemed unfamiliar now, almost hostile. Even making a cup of tea felt like deciphering a set of instructions he had never seen before, and that was when Marilee began appearing at the house in a steady, unobtrusive rhythm. She never announced her arrival with dramatic concern. She simply knocked once, let herself in if he didn't answer quickly enough, and placed whatever she had brought that day on the counter. Some days it was soup. Some days it was mail she'd collected so it wouldn't pile up outside. Some days it was nothing more than her presence, quiet and steady, as though she believed just being in the room might keep the walls from closing in on him. She had always been close to Coralie, close enough that Dmitri knew her voice the way one knows a familiar hallway creak or a commonly used drawer handle. They had shared laughter, disagreements, creative ideas for the shop, and countless small confidences. Now she walked through the house with gentleness, touching nothing she didn't need to, but fixing small things without asking permission. Straightening cushions, reorganizing stray papers, cleaning a spill that Dmitri hadn't noticed. He watched her one afternoon as she rinsed out a mug he had left on the table for 2 days. Her movements were methodical, but not clinical. She washed it the way someone washes a belonging of sentimental value, with a soft focus that honored the memory attached to it. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, drying the mug with a towel that still smelled faintly of Coralie's preferred detergent. "But it helps to give my hands something to do." Her presence filled the room without demanding attention. She asked gentle questions but accepted it when he didn't answer. She nudged him to drink water, to sit down and eat something, to take Lumen for a longer walk when the dog seemed restless. She didn't try to take over his grief. She tried to keep him from falling through the cracks of it. One evening she showed him how to sort the pile of bills and condolences stacked together on the desk. He kept staring at the handwriting on each envelope, trying to recognize which belonged to condolence notes and which belonged to obligations like electricity or insurance. Marilee separated them into categories with careful precision. "You don't have to open everything today, just the important ones," she said. Her tone was steady, not forceful, not subdued, just human. Dmitri nodded because he couldn't bring himself to speak. For the first time in days, he felt something close to support that didn't drown him. Marilee didn't replace Coralie. She didn't try to. She simply helped him survive one small task at a time. Grief speaks in different voices, depending on who carries it. For Dimitri, it sounded like silence, heavy, motionless, and cold. For Marilee, it sounded like a constant hum under her ribs, a near tearfulness that made her swallow hard before speaking. They did not grieve in the same way, but they grieved the same woman, and that shared truth formed a fragile bridge between them. One evening, rain tapped the windows with persistent fingers. Dimitri sat at the kitchen table staring at a half-finished bowl of soup. He shifted the spoon in slow circles without eating. His eyes were tired, the kind of tiredness that does not come from lack of sleep, but from emotional exhaustion that bends the spine. Marilee entered quietly, removing her damp coat and shaking off the droplets. Lumen greeted her with a small whine, pressing his head into her thigh. She scratched behind his ears, then settled into the chair across from Dimitri. "Did you eat?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He shook his head. "Me neither," she admitted. "Food tastes strange right now." The confession surprised him. Most people, when speaking to someone grieving, carefully avoided any comparison. But she was not trying to console him with platitudes. She was describing her own heartbreak, and somehow that made the room feel less suffocating. They sat there for a long while, listening to the rain. Eventually, Marilee said softly, "I keep expecting her to walk into the shop and scold me for rearranging her display. She hated when I moved her favorite vases." Despite everything, a small sound escaped Dimitri, half sob, half laugh. "She used to hide the good scissors from you," he murmured. "That she did." Marilee smiled through tears that finally slipped free. "Because she said I trimmed stems like I was in a hurry." The shared memory gave form to the emptiness otherwise drifting between them. They talked about Coralie then, about her habit of picking leaves off plants when she was thinking, about how she color-coordinated the spice rack twice a month, about the way she narrated her day without meaning to, as if someone were listening to her inner monologue, talking about her hurt, but not talking about her hurt far worse. At one point, Dimitri pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and whispered, "I don't know what to do without her." Marilee reached across the table, not to hold his hand, but to place her fingers lightly against his wrist. "You don't have to know," she said. "Not yet." It wasn't comfort, and Dimitri found himself exhaling for the first time in hours. Shared grief didn't erase the pain, but it made the loneliness a little less sharp. On the 8th day after the funeral, the letters surfaced. They had been tucked inside a small wooden box Coralie kept in the studio room, where she stored dried petals, ribbon scraps, and notes for future arrangements. Dimitri hadn't opened the box since she died. The idea of rummaging through her things felt like rummaging through her presence. But that afternoon, while looking for a misplaced leash for Lumen, he found the lid slightly ajar. Inside, nestled between crushed lavender sprigs and a faded postcard, were 2 sealed envelopes. The first one had his name written in her tidy loops, Dimitri. The second had Marilee written in the same delicate hand. His breath caught. He recognized the slant in the letters, the small flourish at the end of her R, the slight pressure on downward strokes. It felt as though her fingertip had just lifted from the page. He called out, voice trembling, "Marilee, could you come here?" She entered the room and stopped abruptly when she saw what he held. Her hand flew to her mouth. The shock in her eyes was unmistakable, recognition mixed with pain. "She gave those to me months ago," she whispered. "She told me to keep them safe. She said to deliver yours only if something ever happened." Dimitri swallowed hard. "Did she say anything else?" A pause. "She said they weren't instructions, just thoughts she wanted us to have if life changed in ways we didn't expect." They sat on the edge of the bed, knees almost touching but not quite. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, tapping the roof in uneven rhythms. Dimitri opened his letter first. The scent of dried lavender rose from the paper as he unfolded it. Her words were simple but full of warmth. "My love, if you are reading this, I didn't get to stay as long as I wanted. Please don't let my absence freeze your heart in place. I want you to wake up each morning without a weight that belongs to me. Be kind to yourself. And if someone comes into your life who helps you breathe again, don't push them away because of me. I want your future to be full, not empty. Love always, Coralie. Dmitri pressed the page against his chest as if the gesture might anchor him. Tears blurred the letters, but he didn't wipe them away. Marily hesitated before opening her own letter. She looked at Dmitri with a question in her eyes. Is it okay? Go ahead, he said quietly. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. My dear friend, you have been my constant since childhood. If life changes suddenly, promise me something. Stay near Dmitri, not because he is fragile, but because your steadiness can help him find the ground again. You have a gift for restoring things without making them feel repaired. Use that gift, not out of duty, but because you care in ways you rarely admit. Thank you for being my truest friend. See, when she finished reading, she pressed both palms against her eyes. A sound escaped her, quiet, heartbroken. Dmitri reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. The letters changed something between them, not in a romantic way, but in a way that reshaped the terrain of their grief. Coralie's words sat between them like a gentle lantern in a dark room, illuminating emotions they hadn't dared confront. That evening, Dmitri placed the letters in the center of the table. He and Marily sat on either side, the lamplight casting soft halos around the edges of the pages. Neither spoke at first. The weight of the letters lingered, turning the silence into something almost sacred. Finally, Dmitri whispered, She thought of us even then. Marily nodded slowly. Her eyelashes glistened, still wet from earlier tears. She always planned ahead, even when it made no sense to the rest of us. He traced a fingertip along the edge of the envelope. She didn't want us to fall apart. She knew we might, Marily said, her voice barely audible. For a moment, Dmitri felt the room tilt again, not with shock, but with the realization that Coralie had trusted them both in ways he hadn't fully understood. She'd seen something in their strengths, in their steadiness. She'd believed they could carry each other if life demanded it. The idea humbled him. Marily let out a long breath, folding her hands together to keep them from shaking. I don't know how to help you the right way, she said. I'm guessing through every moment. You're helping, he replied, surprising them both with the firmness in his voice. She looked at him then, not with romantic longing, not with guilt, but with a quiet, difficult affection, the kind that comes from knowing someone's pain so well you can recognize it just by watching how they move their hands. Dmitri leaned back in his chair, exhausted but somehow lighter. Do you think she knew how hard this would be for us? Yes, Marily said. And I think that's why she wrote these. Her gaze shifted to the letters again. They read them a second time, then a third, not to memorize the words but to feel them, to let Coralie's intention settle into their bones. Later, as the night deepened, Marily helped him wash the dishes. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the sink, passing plates back and forth without speaking. It wasn't domestic. It wasn't intimate. It was simply two grieving people finding rhythm in a small task, the way drowning swimmers might find rhythm in breathing. When she finally prepared to leave, Dmitri walked her to the door. Thank you, he said softly. You don't have to thank me. I do, he insisted. Because you stayed. Marily swallowed. I told her I would. It was the closest either of them had come to naming the truth, that Coralie's absence had bound them together in a way neither had asked for, yet neither could deny. As days passed, the emotional distance between Dmitri and the rest of the community grew wider. People meant well, they truly did, but small towns often struggle to balance empathy and curiosity. And before long, curiosity began to prevail. Neighbors came by with casseroles, baked goods, kind letters, and attempts at distraction. But when they returned to their own homes, conversations took on a different tone. It's strange how close Marily is to him already. Well, she was Coralie's best friend. Yes, but still, she's there every day. Maybe he shouldn't rely on her so much. Nobody was cruel. They simply spoke with the ease of people who believed they understood more than they did. At the grocery store, two women paused by the produce section, lowering their voices as Dmitri walked past. I saw her car outside his house again this morning. He must be so lonely. Of course he's lonely, but it's fast, don't you think? Others defended him. They're grieving the same person. Who else would understand? You don't abandon a friend who just lost his wife. Still, the conversations carried a subtle edge. an implication that the closeness wasn't entirely innocent, or that grief had blurred certain boundaries. Dmitri tried not to notice. He tried even harder not to care, but the comments reached him indirectly, through hesitant looks, through sympathetic smiles that held a shadow of judgment, through the way people paused before approaching him, as if measuring whether his emotions were appropriate that day. Marilee felt it too. She noticed how conversations shifted when she entered a room, how people tried to appear neutral but couldn't hide their curiosity. She saw the exchanged glances, the small pursed lips, the forced kindness. One afternoon, while she was helping Dmitri sort through paperwork, she hesitated before speaking. "People are starting to talk," she said quietly. He didn't look up from the documents. They talked after the accident. They'll talk now. "It's different," she murmured. "How so?" She hesitated. "They think I'm here too much." He paused, paper halfway to being placed on the table. He looked at her then, truly looked, seeing the discomfort in her posture. "You're here because I need help," he said, "and because I can't stand being alone with my own thoughts," she admitted. Her honesty softened something tight in his chest. "Let them talk," he said gently. For the first time since the funeral, he offered her a small, sincere smile. But the murmurs in town were not baseless gossip. They were early seeds of tension that would grow later, tension neither Dmitri nor Marilee intended, but couldn't yet avoid. As the second week unfolded, something subtle began to shift. It wasn't romance. It wasn't longing. It was a quiet reliance taking root in moments when neither expected grounding. One evening, the power flickered during a windstorm. The lamps dimmed, shadows stretched across the living room, and a small thump from outside made Lumen bark. Dmitri stood by the window, watching branches sway, when Marilee arrived, drenched from the weather. "You shouldn't have come in this storm," he said as he handed her a towel. "I didn't want you sitting here alone," she replied. The wind pushed against the siding, rattling the gutter. For a moment, the house felt both too small and too exposed. They sat together on the couch, listening to the storm rumble. Lumen curled beside them, resting his head on Dmitri's knee. Neither spoke, and yet the silence didn't feel empty. It felt shared. The letters lay on the coffee table, their folded edges visible. Dmitri stared at them, then at the reflection of the stormy sky in the window. For a split second the room flickered again, light dimming, then returning. In his mind, Coralie's handwriting appeared overlaying the scene, her loops and curves floating like soft brushstrokes. A brief mental whisper of her voice, reading the last line of her letter, echoed through him, not as sound, but as a memory with texture. "Be kind to whoever holds the next part of your heart." The image blinked away as the power steadied, leaving him with a deep ache and an odd sense of warmth. Marilee cleared her throat softly. "Do you want me to go?" she asked. "No," he said quickly, before thinking. "No, please stay." Something passed between them then. Not affection, not obligation, but understanding. They talked for a while about ordinary things, a neighbor's broken mailbox, a recipe Coralie once taught them both, memories of summers that now felt both far away and painfully close. Each recollection carved a little more space between their grief and the suffocating silence that had filled the house. At one point, Marilee laughed at a memory involving Coralie getting lost during a hike. The sound was soft and cracked at the edges, but was laughter nonetheless. Dmitri found himself smiling too, not out of forced politeness, but because remembering Coralie with fondness no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like keeping her alive in the only way they still could. Later, when Marilee prepared to leave, she lingered at the door. "Thank you for letting me be here," she said. "You don't have to thank me," he echoed her earlier words. "You're giving me something to hold on to." She nodded, eyes shimmering. "I just hope it's the right thing." "It is," he said. Before she stepped out into the storm, he touched her arm lightly, not a romantic gesture, just a human one. As the door closed behind her, Dmitri exhaled slowly, feeling something unfamiliar, not hope exactly, but the early fragile shadow of it. If you're still with me, and I know you are, hit that like button. It helps this story reach someone who might need it. In a town where most people knew each other's morning routines, a sudden shift in Dmitri and Marilee's closeness churned conversations like stones tumbling in a small stream. At first, the comments were simple observations whispered with sympathetic brows. But as days turned into weeks, the tone shifted from concern to scrutiny. At the bakery, two men lingered over their coffee cups, speaking behind raised palms. "I've seen her car outside his house almost every night. He lost his wife. He needs space, not company. Or maybe he already had company." Across town, a pair of women lowered their voices near the community board. She was Coralie's closest friend. "It just feels improper. He should be mourning. He is mourning. Just not the way they expected." And so it went. Soft accusations clothed in politeness, judgments disguised as concern. The opinions traveled faster than facts, faster than compassion. Soon, even people who normally kept their thoughts private found themselves repeating variations of the same doubt. Why were they spending so much time together? And what did that say about them? Some residents defended them, insisting that grief forged rare bonds and that loyalty sometimes meant showing up consistently. But the ones who disapproved were louder, more animated, more certain. Their tone grew sharper, and in small towns, sharper voices often override quieter truths. Dmitri felt the shift slowly, like a temperature drop before an unexpected frost. Neighbors paused before greeting him, some offering awkward smiles instead of genuine warmth. Others avoided his eyes entirely. A few asked carefully veiled questions about how he was managing, the subtext heavy in their pauses. Marilee felt the tension more directly. At the insurance office, clients asked unnecessary questions about her evenings. One woman said, "You must be exhausted helping him so much," in a tone that suggested she meant something entirely different. Another muttered, "Coralie deserved better," when she thought Marilee wasn't listening. The judgment weighed on both of them, even though neither brought it up right away. Dmitri saw the burden in the way Marilee's shoulders tightened when someone approached them in public. Marilee saw it in how Dmitri's jaw hardened when whispers trailed behind them at the grocery store. The world around them didn't understand their grief, and misunderstanding, when mixed with rumor, becomes accusation. Despite the murmurs spreading through the town, the bond between Dmitri and Marilee didn't develop with speed or recklessness. It grew the way moss grows on stone, quietly without fanfare, shaped by circumstances neither of them asked for. Most evenings began with simple tasks: sorting mail, straightening shelves that felt too empty without Coralie's touch, making tea they sometimes forgot to drink. Lumen lay between them on the rug, occasionally lifting his head as if keeping watch over their fragile connection. One night, Dmitri watched as Marilee folded the afghan draped across the couch. She ran her hand along the edges, smoothing the threads. It wasn't the gesture of someone taking over a household. It was the gesture of someone honoring what remained. "You don't have to stay this late," he said softly. "I know," she replied, still folding. "But I don't like the way silence feels in my house right now." He nodded. He understood entirely. Their conversations were rarely dramatic. They talked about the shop, about the neighbor's new fence, about Lumen's habit of carrying slippers into the living room. Sometimes they talked about Coralie and sometimes they didn't. Both choices felt natural. The closeness built in small steps. When Dmitri forgot to eat lunch, Marilee placed a plate in front of him without comment. When she struggled with her own emotions, he brewed tea and listened without trying to fix anything. When nightmares woke him in the middle of the night, he texted her, and she answered immediately, reminding him he wasn't alone in the dark. People outside the situation believed the bond was something sudden, inappropriate, or impulsive, but if they had witnessed it up close, they would have seen a different truth. Two people building emotional scaffolding to survive a collapse neither had prepared for. Still, neither of them crossed any lines. They didn't speak of romance. They didn't touch more than necessary. They didn't pretend their connection was anything other than what grief had carved out between them. They simply existed together, in the unfinished space that loss had created. It wasn't love, it was survival. The evening had happened. The sky was heavy with the promise of rain. Dmitri sat on the porch with Lumen at his feet, watching the distant clouds gather along the ridge. The quiet was dense, but not uncomfortable. It felt like a pause between breaths. Marilee joined him without knocking, holding 2 mugs of tea that steamed in the cooling air. She handed one to him and settled into the chair beside his. "Heavy sky," she murmured. "Feels appropriate," he said. They sat that way for several minutes, letting the quiet say more than words could. Then, softly, Dmitri said, "I miss her laugh." Merrily nodded. "I miss her stubbornness. She used to rearrange my office whenever she thought I was working too much." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "She did the same to me, claimed she was creating order, when really she just wanted to tease me." They shared a low chuckle, quiet, almost hesitant. The porch light cast a warm glow across their faces, and for a brief moment, the shared memory made the loss feel bearable. The conversation drifted to little moments, stories they'd never told each other because they never needed to before. How Coralie used to bring home stray leaves from the florist's counter. How she made grocery lists in exaggerated handwriting when she was bored. How she used to mimic the mail carrier's whistling when she thought no one was listening. When one particular memory made both of them pause with tight throats, Marilee reached out without thinking. Her hand rested lightly on Dmitri's. It wasn't planned. It wasn't meant to be intimate. It was simply a gesture of comfort, an instinctive offering from someone who shared the same ache. But Dmitri's hand turned palm up beneath hers. And in that small movement, something shifted, not in a romantic blaze, but in a quiet surrender to the reality that they were stronger side by side than apart. She didn't pull away, neither did he. The moment lingered, still, tender, fragile. Their hands stayed together as the first drops of rain tapped the porch railing. When she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, Dmitri let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was the first intimate moment between them. Soft, hesitant, born from grief, not desire. A moment that would change the course of everything that followed. The decision wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a dramatic, tearful confession. It came quietly, shaped by long nights, shared responsibilities, and the weight of Coralie's last words to both of them. It happened on a day when the world outside looked restless, wind tugging at branches, clouds drifting low. Dmitri and Marilee were sorting more of Coralie's belongings, carefully deciding what to keep and what to donate. They found her floral apron folded in a drawer. Both paused. Dmitri held it gently, thumb brushing the faded pattern. "She wore this the day we planted the tulips," he murmured. "I remember," Marilee said. "She spilled soil on herself and laughed so hard she cried." He sat on the edge of the bed, the apron pooled across his lap. "She never wanted people to be alone," he said quietly. "I know." He looked up at her, eyes tired, honest. "I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I do know that when you leave, the house feels vacant. When you're here, it feels bearable." Marilee swallowed. "I feel the same," she admitted. "But people will judge us. They already are." He nodded. "Yes, they will. But we can't live our lives based on their expectations." Silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Dmitri placed the apron aside, stood, and approached her. His voice softened. "I don't want to lose the only steady thing I have left. Not when you're the one person who understands all of this." She looked up, eyes glistening with uncertainty and warmth. "What are you saying?" He took a slow breath. The words hung between them, not heavy, not rushed, simply true. She didn't answer immediately. She pressed her fingertips to her lips, thinking, trembling. "People will think we're betraying her. We're honoring her," he said. "She asked us both to keep living. Not separately, not in suffering." She exhaled shakily. Her voice broke when she replied, "Okay." And with that single agreement, a strange sense of calm settled over the room. There were no rings, no grand gestures, no sudden passion. Just two grieving souls making a decision based on survival, companionship, and the permission Coralie had given them in the letters. The wedding happened on a Tuesday morning, in a room more suited for paperwork than vows. Dmitri wore a jacket that still carried a faint scent of sawdust. Marilee wore a cream blouse, simple and unadorned. There were no guests, no music, no decorations beyond a single wilted bouquet left behind from another ceremony earlier that day. A clerk greeted them with a polite smile that didn't pry. She guided them through the process with the same tone she might use for a name change or license renewal, steady, respectful, without curiosity. Dmitri's hands trembled when he picked up the pen. A flash of memory passed through him, Coralie laughing as she scolded him for forgetting to sign a delivery receipt at the shop. He swallowed hard and forced himself to focus. When he signed his name beside Marilee's, his chest tightened. not with regret, not with guilt, but with the sobering realization that life had veered into a direction he never could have imagined months earlier. Marilee's signature was steadier, though her lips trembled slightly. She kept glancing at the window, almost as if expecting Coralie to appear outside, teasing them about paperwork or telling them they'd forgotten to bring their lunch. When the clerk pronounced them married, the words felt almost too quiet for the significance they carried. There were no cheers, no applause, no dramatic pauses. Just a gentle acknowledgement that two people had chosen to stand together in a world that had taken someone precious from them both. They exchanged a brief kiss, soft, respectful, hesitant. It was an apology to sorrow, and a vow to carry each other through whatever came next. Lumen sat beside them, tail thumping once against the floor. Outside, the wind scattered a pile of leaves across the courthouse steps. A passerby nodded politely. A neighbor blinked in surprise but offered a shy congratulations before hurrying away, no doubt already forming a story to whisper later. They walked to the car hand in hand. Not tightly, just enough to stay balanced. They weren't celebrating a beginning, they were surviving an ending together. The news traveled through the town faster than anyone expected. By late afternoon, every cafe, hardware store, and mailbox cluster was buzzing with a mixture of shock, disappointment, sympathy, and disbelief. Some residents reacted with genuine concern. He's grieving. People cope in different ways. They're both heartbroken. Maybe they're just trying to support each other. Others reacted with harsher tones. It's disgraceful. She just died. And now this. A few who had admired Coralie felt personally offended, as though the marriage invalidated their memory of her. They spoke louder than necessary, as if the volume of their judgment could somehow protect her legacy. But pockets of compassion formed too. She trusted them, said one elderly neighbor who remembered Coralie as a child. She wouldn't have wanted them drowning in sorrow. The town divided into two subtle camps, those who viewed the marriage as an act of betrayal, and those who viewed it as an attempt to heal in an unbearably lonely season. Dmitri felt the shift immediately. At the grocery store, a woman he'd known for years turned away abruptly when he walked down her aisle. At the post office, a man offered a stiff handshake but didn't meet his eyes. At the bakery, the cashier hesitated before speaking, as if unsure of the right tone to use. Marilee endured even sharper reactions. Several clients canceled their appointments at the insurance office. A pair of teenagers made rude remarks when she passed by the schoolyard. Someone left an unsigned note on her windshield that said, "Too soon." She threw the note away without telling Dmitri. But despite the social strain, a smaller, quieter group defended them. A retired teacher brought them fresh bread. A mother of 3 left a warm casserole at their door. A young couple slipped a card into their mailbox that read, "Love doesn't follow rules." The world around them had become both shelter and battlefield. To outsiders, their marriage seemed abrupt, reckless even. But inside the quiet of their home, the choice made a different kind of sense. It wasn't driven by passion or impulse. It was shaped by emotional exhaustion, shared responsibility, fear of isolation, and the lingering guidance of Coralie's final message. Both of them were drowning, in different ways. Dmitri felt every corner of the house collapsing inward, each room echoing with absence. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with memories that refused to soften. He woke from dreams reaching for someone who wasn't there. He needed someone who understood every corner of the grief that gripped him. Marilee, on the other hand, faced a different void. She had lost not only her closest friend, but the future they had imagined growing old as companions, sharing gardens and stories. Her home felt hollow, each drawer and chair reminding her of Coralie's laughter or quiet advice. And she felt guilty for moving through those empty rooms alone while Dmitri struggled only a few streets away. They didn't marry because they were in love. They married because grief had stripped them down to their most vulnerable selves, and in that vulnerability, they found steadiness in each other. Psychologically, they were seeking stability, a foundation to anchor their days, continuity, a way to honor Coralie by caring for each other, just as she had asked. Coralie's letters loomed large in their minds, not as commands, but as kindness preserved on paper. She had offered the one thing neither could give themselves, the freedom to heal in unconventional ways. Their marriage wasn't about replacing anyone. It was about refusing to let grief consume them whole. in a way. They were building a bridge between what was lost and what remained. Fragile, trembling, but still standing. The early days of their marriage did not feel like a celebration. They felt like walking through a house half lit, half dark. Every hallway held echoes of Corley's footsteps. Every room held objects she touched. Dimitri and Marilee navigated this landscape with caution, aware that tenderness and pain often lived side by side. One evening, they sat on the couch with Lumen curled between them. Neither spoke for a long time. The letters lay on the table, the edges slightly frayed from being read so often. In Dimitri's mind, a memory flickered. Coralie kneeling in the garden, brushing soil from her palms. Her voice drifted through him, not as sound, but as a remembered warmth. "Promise me you'll both keep living. Don't freeze yourselves in place." The image dissolved, leaving him breathless. Marilee noticed the shift in his posture. "Another memory?" she asked gently. He nodded. "It felt like she was right here. She's still part of us," Marilee whispered. "That doesn't disappear because our lives changed." They sat in quiet understanding. Permission. That was what Coralie had given them. Permission to breathe again. Permission to lean on each other. Permission to step into a future neither wanted but both needed. Loneliness still touched them, curling through certain hours of the night. But they had someone to reach for now. Someone who felt the same ache, who understood the same ghosts. Healing came not as a single upward climb, but as small mercies. Sharing a quiet meal, repairing a chair together, tending the garden she once loved. Sometimes healing looked like tears shared without shame. Sometimes it looked like laughter that surprised them both. Sometimes it looked like simply sitting in a room without feeling utterly alone. Their marriage wasn't tidy. It wasn't traditional. It didn't follow the rules people expected. But it became something steady. A partnership shaped by honesty, memory, and the belief that life, even fractured, could still carry softness. Months folded into one another in a domestic haze, small improvements, recurring aches, the slow rethreading of daily life. It was the kind of time that makes dates fuzzy. People measured it by plantings and holidays rather than by numbered days. So when the phone rang in late autumn, at a moment when Dimitri had nearly convinced himself nothing else would pierce that season of quiet, the sound felt startling. He answered, expecting an ordinary query. Instead, the voice on the other end had a clarity Dimitri hadn't heard in months. A detective from the county office, calling with an update that would reopen parts of his heart he had learned to keep carefully wrapped. "We've located the vehicle we believe was involved in the collision that killed Coralie," the detective said. He spoke evenly, offering details in a manner that had no theatrics. License plate traced, registration checked, the owner contacted. "We would like to meet with you and discuss the next steps." Dimitri sat down before the words fully landed. The house felt suddenly too quiet. He found himself listening to the phone as if it might change tone and offer some other outcome, one where nothing had to be faced again. When he hung up, he realized Marilee had been watching him from the kitchen doorway. Her face registered the moment like a map, the sudden stillness, the small slouch of shoulders. He told her what the detective had said. They moved toward action the way people do when a past wound requires tending, slowly, deliberatively, with a sense that the old grief might reopen. They decided to meet the detective at the station the next morning. Dimitri slept poorly that night, not from worry about the meeting, but because reopening the case felt like opening a ledger of pain and possibilities. He wondered, would this bring relief or another layer of sorrow? As the house settled around them, he understood how fragile the human attempt at closure could be. Sometimes it arrives like a balm, sometimes it cracks alongside the scab it's meant to help. By dawn, their resolve had hardened into motion. The pair left the house together, two people who had already learned how to shoulder the next difficult moments side by side. The detective met them with a plain folder and a steady expression. He laid out what the investigation had uncovered: a car registered to a nearby town, a young driver caught on a traffic camera that had briefly captured the vehicle's silhouette near the stretch of road in question, a witness who remembered the vehicle's color and the way it drove off too quickly. The culprit, as the file revealed, was a 19-year-old whose name felt too young against the gravity of the event. The detective explained that after obtaining permission and verifying details, officers had located the driver at home. He had not planned to stay. Panic had prompted him to leave, to vanish into a direction that felt safer than facing the consequence. When Dmitri finally met the young person in a room flushed with fluorescent light and an awkward hush, he looked like someone who had been pulled forward into responsibility too early. His shoulders were narrow under a plain jacket. His eyes darted to the floor, then to Dmitri and back again. He fumbled with the strap of his backpack like an anchor. "Sir," he began, voice cracking on the first syllable. "I'm so sorry. I panicked. I didn't mean to. I just left." The confession spilled out in fits and starts. The screech of tires, the sudden impact, the rush of fear, the decision to keep driving because his immediate focus had shifted to preserving himself rather than stopping to check. Now, weeks later, he sat under the mentor-like calm of the detective's presence and the steady stare of the man whose life had been split by that single instant. It was simple to name the driver's action. He fled. Harder to name what lived inside him, a raw remorse that arrived in jagged breaths and whispered apologies. In those first minutes they spoke, it was clear the teen didn't have motives of malice. He had a wholly human response of fright, and then a lifetime of consequences to reckon with. Dmitri listened. He catalogued the facts, and beneath the facts, something else began to stir. An uneasy question about what justice could look like in a case where fear, not cruelty, had dictated the first choice. When the teen's words drifted into the hush of the interview room, Dmitri felt old and raw, as though the last months had been a brittle shell that the smallest touch could break. Rage rose in him first, hot and immediate. How could anyone flee another person in need? How could someone disappear while a life was being erased? He imagined retribution, courtrooms, punishment, penalties that measured out a satisfaction like weights on a scale. The initial instinct was vindication, some formal ledger where hurt was balanced by consequence. But alongside the fury, something else wound through him, ambiguous and stubborn. He pictured a younger version of himself, 19 and terrified, making a poor decision out of instinct. He thought of Coralie's handwriting, of her request that he live without a grin of regret stitched across his face. He thought of the way she had asked both of them to keep loving, to practice kindness even when it hurt. It was a confusing negotiation between two hands pulling in opposite directions, one demanding punishment and closure, the other whispering for something softer. Revenge promised a clarity that would make the world tidy again. Compassion promised a harder, slower kind of repair. As the teen sat before him, tears drying on his cheeks, Dmitri felt each option tug. He also felt the weight of responsibility, not only as a man who had lost a life, but as someone who could decide whether to let anger shape the future for everyone involved. The detective quietly observed his silence, offering no prompt. Marilee's presence, the memory of letters, the town's fragile fabric, everything factored into the calculus. The choice was not between forgetting and remembering. It was between making the world an act of retaliation or an act of mending. When he left the station that day, Dmitri carried the conflict with him like a stone in his coat, heavy, unavoidable, needing direction. Back at the car, Marilee reached for his hand without speaking. The touch was small, but it anchored him. She had watched him wrestle with the decision, had heard his silence as much as his thoughts. In the quiet that followed the meeting, she offered a steadiness that was not demanding, it was invitational. "You don't have to decide by yourself," she said softly. "We can walk this together." Her support took many forms. Sometimes it was practical, helping him arrange meetings with the detective, going with him to legal consultations, filing paperwork he couldn't focus on. Other times it was simply presence, sitting on a bench while he smoked and letting him vent, listening when he spoke in fragments, offering a hand to squeeze when he felt the vertigo of the memory come back. Marilee never urged him toward any particular emotion. She didn't push for leniency or for punishment. Instead, she reminded him of the person Coralie had been, someone who believed in second chances and in turning harm into something constructive when possible. Her reminders were not manipulative appeals, but quiet reflections born of intimate knowledge of Coralie's values. When guilt threatened to choke him, she reminded him of what Coralie had written in ink that now felt prophetic, a kindness extended forward as permission to live. She would not let him reduce that instruction to a platitude. She made it a living thing that required action and thought. Her support also meant she sometimes had to stand firm against his darker impulses. When he leaned toward retribution simply to feel power again, she would ask small questions. What does justice mean to you? Who benefits from punishment? Those questions weren't cold logic. They were an attempt to get him to reckon with the aftermath beyond his anger. She stayed beside him not because she had answers, but because she believed they could find a way to honor Coralie's memory that didn't undo them both. Her steadiness became the ballast he needed as he considered a path that had to take into account not only his pain, but the possibility of repairing harm. Dmitri had imagined many outcomes in the privacy of night. The young driver punished, a measure of satisfaction delivered. Yet as days passed and conversations softened, he found himself drawn to a different, more complicated option. He began to consider an approach focused less on retribution and more on repair, a form of accountability that demanded action and responsibility without becoming a revenge spectacle. Restorative justice offered a framework, acknowledgement of harm, meaningful accountability, and opportunity for those hurt to shape the outcome. It wasn't about letting the driver escape consequence. It was about transforming the aftermath into something that could prevent similar harm and help a young person confront their actions honestly. When he presented the idea to the detective, the officer listened, then explained the practical components needed: community service connected to road safety, participation in driver education programs, regular meetings with a mentor, public acknowledgement of responsibility, and contributed time at the community center where Coralie had volunteered and where her presence had been so vivid. The goal would be both symbolic and practical, acts that spoke to repair rather than a purely punitive sentence. It was not an easy choice. There were nights when doubt returned and the desire for punitive clarity resurfaced. But each time, Dmitri read Coralie's letter again, feeling her instruction not as an order but as an invitation to consider how repair might honor her life more than vengeance would. He also thought about the young driver, not as a faceless culprit, but as someone whose panic had produced a tragic outcome. The restorative route required the driver to look up from his shame and act in ways that would teach him the cost of his fear. The proposal moved forward with careful conditions. It included supervision, structured restitution, and a public forum where the driver would commit to accountability. Dmitri insisted on terms that ensured the outcome would be meaningful and visible: education, service, and a sustained commitment to making amends. It was a path that demanded courage from everyone involved, including the young man whose life would now be reoriented by responsibility rather than simple punishment. The day Dmitri confronted the driver with the terms arranged for restorative steps was quiet and intense. They met in a community room with pale walls and folding chairs. The young man kept his eyes down. The detective sat nearby, documenting the exchange. Merle was present, not to direct but to witness. Before any terms were put into writing, Dmitri unfolded Coralie's letter, the one she had given him months earlier, and held it where the young driver could see the careful loops of her handwriting. The paper had become a moral instrument, not by accident but by intention, a reminder that the person lost had once asked those still living to choose how they would keep going. Dmitri read aloud, his voice low and steady while the room listened. "My love, if you are reading this, I didn't get to stay as long as I wanted. Please don't let my absence freeze your heart in place. I want you to wake each morning without a weight that belongs to me. Be kind to yourself, and if someone comes into your life who helps you breathe again, don't push them away because of me." The words floated in the room like a soft instruction. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it on the table. The teenager's shoulders shook as he heard the passage. He swallowed hard and looked up for the first time, and in his eyes was the rawness of someone who had been carrying something heavy and unnameable. "Sir," he said, voice a thin thread, "I have replayed that morning every day. I have replayed it in my head 1,000 times. I have nightmares. I wanted to stop, but I ran, not because I didn't care, but because I was terrified." He paused, the words jagged and small. "I have no excuse. I only—" His breath stuttered. "I never meant to hurt anyone." Dmitri listened. He felt a swell of different things: the heat of anger, the ache of loss, and an unexpected thread of compassion toward the trembling young man. who'd become a vessel for consequences he couldn't undo. Then the practical elements began. Agreements about community center hours, teaching driver safety workshops, mandatory enrollment in an educational program about trauma, verified volunteer work with an elder outreach program, and public apology sessions mediated by the detective. The teen agreed, tears streaking his face, his promise fragile and earnest. The restorative path required him to face his action in satisfying ways that benefited the community and acknowledge the harm done. It would not erase the past, but it created a forward pathway that demanded responsibility rather than passivity. For Dmitri, the decision didn't erase pain. It shaped it into something with a direction, a way to insist that harm be answered not only by punishment but by active repair. Word of the restorative agreement moved through town in uneven waves. Some people applauded quietly, others reacted with resistance. There were those who viewed Dmitri's stance as magnanimity, an act of compassion that could teach everyone about accountability that transforms rather than merely penalizes. They spoke of prevention and of the good that might come from a young person learning to give back in meaningful ways. Others disagreed sharply. They wanted a straightforward legal punishment, fines, suspension, perhaps even jail time. To them, restorative measures felt insufficient, an attempt to soften consequences for a grievous loss. Those voices were loud in coffee shops and in the grocery aisles. In small communities, anger can travel quickly and lodge in unexpected places. Marilee endured snide remarks and quiet disapproval. Some neighbors left notes, some clients of her office declined to meet with her. But a different set of gestures emerged, cards with messages of cautious respect, casseroles from people who approved in private, a retired teacher offering to host safety workshops at the community center, where the young driver would later volunteer. The young man's listing of community hours became public knowledge. He addressed small groups, spoke with trembling honesty at school assemblies about the terror that drove him to flee, and worked under supervision to teach safety. Over time, people began to see him not only as someone who made a catastrophic mistake, but as someone actively trying to repair the damage. Not everyone forgave. Some never would, and that, Dmitri understood, was part of reality. Forgiveness could not be demanded or manufactured. It might arrive in pieces or never come at all. The restorative agreement did not erase resentment, nor did it attempt to. Instead, it invited the community to consider a model of accountability that required labor, humility, and public acknowledgement. It asked everyone to weigh retribution's short relief against repair's longer, harder recovery. For Dmitri and Marilee, the approach did not bring back what they had lost, but it gave them a way to channel grief into action that might prevent another family from facing the same void. The choice was imperfect, challenging, and, in its small way, faithful to the intentions Corley had set down when she thought of those she loved. Time did not erase the past, it reshaped it. The years that followed became a quiet reconstruction, not rapid, not miraculous, but steady in the way seasons arrive even when the heart feels unprepared for them. Dmitri and Marilee settled into a rhythm that felt less like escape and more like adaptation. Their home, once heavy with sorrow, found a new balance, laughter that arrived cautiously at first, then more freely, long conversations that started in whispers and grew into comfort, mornings that didn't ache quite as sharply. They kept certain routines the same. Dmitri still brewed coffee the way Coralie once liked it. Marilee kept the kitchen window open on mild days, letting fresh air sweep in as a reminder that life continues. Yet the house gradually reflected both of them, her tidy stacks of paperwork near the desk, his woodworking tools leaning neatly in their corner, their shared books gathering dog-eared edges. There were still days when Dmitri felt the weight of loss like a sudden drop in temperature. On those days, he would sit quietly at the kitchen table, letting memories move through him without resistance. Marilee never tried to pull him out of those moments. She would simply sit nearby, reading or working, her presence a soft anchor. The rebuilding of their lives wasn't about replacing what had been lost. It was about honoring what remained, kindness, companionship, and the commitment to keep moving, even when grief lingered at the door. Step by step, they learned how to inhabit a life that carried both ache and warmth. The decision to reopen the flower shop came one afternoon in early spring, years after the accident. They had walked past the storefront dozens of times, always pausing to look through the dusty windows. The interior still held shadows of Coralie's arrangements. Vases forgotten on shelves, a few decorative ribbons curling at the ends, a faded calendar marking a month-long past. "This place shouldn't stay frozen," Marilee said softly one day. "She built joy here." Dimitri stood beside her, hand brushing the glass. "I think she'd want people to walk in and feel welcome again." And so they swept the floors, washed the windows, and sorted through what could be salvaged. The shop reopened part-time, not as a full business venture, but as a tribute. They arranged small bouquets on weekends, crafted simple centerpieces for local events, and kept a small display of fresh blooms near the entrance. The community responded gently. Some customers came out of nostalgia, others out of genuine support. People who had known Coralie shared stories. Funny ones, tender ones, small memories that still bloomed in their minds. Running the shop never felt like trying to recreate the past. Instead, it felt like keeping the best parts alive. The warmth she brought to strangers, the comfort she offered through petals and stems, the reminder that beauty can be grown even after something breaks. On quiet afternoons, Dimitri would pause by the counter and whisper, "She'd like this," and Marilee would smile, knowing he meant more than the arrangement in front of them. Their backyard garden became their shared sanctuary. It started with a small patch, the one Coralie had tended with gentle persistence. Over the years, Dimitri and Marilee expanded it, not to replace her work, but to carry it forward. The soil, once a reminder of grief, slowly became a symbol of continuity. They planted tulips each spring, the same variety Coralie had loved. They added lavender bushes along the fence, roses near the trellis, and a cluster of marigolds beside the walkway. Every bloom held a small history. Every row carried intention. On warm mornings, they walked through the garden with coffee in hand. The air smelled of damp soil and new growth. Birds nested in the nearby trees. Lumen wandered between the beds, slower now but still curious, still faithful. Occasionally, Dimitri paused to touch a leaf or adjust a stem, whispering something only the plants or the breeze could hear. Marilee often knelt beside him to pull weeds or check for new buds. They didn't rush the work. Gardening was not a chore, it was a ceremony, a quiet conversation with the past. Rainy days gave the garden a gentle glisten. Sunny afternoons made the petals brighten like soft lanterns. Even on hard days, the garden offered a small refuge. Standing among the flowers gave them a reminder. Life continues in quiet, persistent ways. In tending the garden, they were tending their own hearts, allowing pain and beauty to exist in the same soil. Lumen aged alongside them, his golden coat lightening around the muzzle, his steps losing the bounce they once had. He had been a witness to everything, the laughter of the past, the sorrow of the middle years, and now the calm that rested over the household like a soft blanket. As he grew older, he began to sleep more frequently, stretched out on his favorite rug near the patio door. He no longer chased birds or darted after passing shadows. Instead, he wagged his tail slowly when Dimitri returned from work or when Marilee knelt to scratch behind his ears. They adapted their routines around him. Walks became shorter, slower, more thoughtful. Dimitri spoke to him quietly during their strolls, telling stories or simply commenting on the neighborhood, as if Lumen understood every word. Maybe he did. Dogs often understand more than they reveal. On especially tender mornings, Lumen would rest his head on Dimitri's leg, sighing as if releasing years he had carried alongside them. He was not just a pet, he was a thread woven through every chapter of their lives. When storms rolled through, he leaned against Marilee for comfort. When the garden bloomed, he would sit in the shade, watching them work with half-closed eyes. The softness of his aging became its own lesson. Time moves, and we move with it. Slowing down isn't a loss, it's a gentle stage, a reminder to savor what remains. Grief never vanished completely. It changed shape, softened at the edges, and found its place in Dimitri's life, not as a wound but as a quiet presence. There were still moments when memories arrived unexpectedly, a particular scent in the flower shop, a phrase someone used, a melody drifting from a passing car. Sometimes the memories made him pause and inhale deeply, gathering himself against the sudden ache. Other times, they brought a faint smile, like a warm echo of something once cherished. He spoke about Coralie openly, without flinching. Merrily listened with understanding, never threatened by the lingering love he carried. They both respected that grief could coexist with new affection, that the heart was not a single room but a home with many chambers. On anniversaries, Dmitri visited the spot where the accident happened, not to relive the past, but to offer a moment of acknowledgement for the life taken, for the years reshaped, for the young driver whose remorse had grown into responsibility. Each visit became gentler with time. He also reread Corley's letter every few months, not out of desperation but out of gratitude. It reminded him that her love had been generous enough to extend beyond her life, guiding him toward healing instead of self-punishment. His grief no longer dominated his days. It lived inside him quietly, a soft memory folded into the fabric of everything he had become. As years collected, Dmitri and Merrili's marriage evolved into something both understated and deeply steady. There were no dramatic gestures, no loud declarations. Instead, their love emerged from shared routines, mutual trust, and the understanding that healing requires gentleness more than spectacle. They balanced each other effortlessly. Dmitri brought patience and a quiet humor that surfaced when least expected. Merrily brought structure and emotional insight, helping them navigate the delicate spaces where remembrance and new beginnings intertwined. Evenings often found them reading together by lamplight, each absorbed in separate books but connected through presence. On weekends, they cooked meals side by side, moving around the kitchen with a choreography shaped by habit and affection. When one had a difficult day, the other leaned in, not with solutions, but with a touch on the shoulder or a shared cup of tea. Their partnership was not built on filling the void left by loss. It was built on acknowledging that loss had shaped them and choosing to build forward from that place with clarity, not shame. There were moments of quiet joy, shared jokes, unexpected compliments, peaceful silence. And there were moments of vulnerability when old wounds resurfaced. During those times, they held each other without hesitation. Their marriage became proof that love can be mended, reshaped, and rediscovered, even after unimaginable pain, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. One early summer morning, sunlight filtered through the leaves in gentle strokes. The garden was in full bloom, tulips swaying lightly, roses unfolding, lavender casting its soothing scent across the yard. In the center of it all sat the wooden bench Dmitri had carved himself. The bench was simple, sturdy, shaped with hands that had once built cabinets and now built memories. Along the top rail, he had etched a small inscription, "For the ones we carry with us." He and Merrily sat side by side, Lumen resting at their feet, breathing in the warm air. Birds flitted between branches. A soft breeze rustled the flowers, making them nod as if in greeting. "This place feels complete," Merrily said quietly. Dmitri nodded. "It feels like all of us are here, even the parts of the past." They sat in easy silence, watching the morning unfold. The bench held them like a gentle cradle, steady, unhurried. Dmitri ran his fingers along the engraved words, letting the texture remind him of the journey that had shaped them all. In that moment, the garden wasn't a memorial or a burden. It was a place where love, sorrow, growth, and hope existed together. A place where Coralie's memory lived without overshadowing their present. "Love doesn't disappear," Dmitri said softly. "It just changes form." Merrily leaned her head against his shoulder. "And we learn to carry each form with kindness." The garden shimmered in the morning light, a testament to healing, continuity, and the possibility of life after heartbreak. With the years behind them and a calmer stretch of life ahead, Dmitri and Merrily had learned something many people never fully accept. Love is not limited to one chapter. It adapts, grows, folds itself into new corners. It can hold memories of the past and hopes for the future simultaneously. Their journey had not been simple. It had carried sorrow, misunderstanding, judgment, forgiveness, and unexpected tenderness. But from each stage, they learned truths worth keeping. That grief has no schedule. That healing is not betrayal. That compassion can reshape even the sharpest pain. That love at its best invites us to move forward without erasing what we came from. They built a life that honored both the woman they lost and the partnership they found. Their home became filled with layers of affection, one rooted in memory, one rooted in the present, both genuine in their own right. On evenings when the sun dipped low and painted the garden gold, Dmitri often whispered, "Thank you," not knowing if he was speaking to the past, to the present, or to both. Love had changed shape, but it had never left. If this story touched your heart today, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs hope. Story 2. 10 years of silence ended with a single breath. Mason Wyatt's eyes opened slowly, as if the world he'd been kept from was too bright to face all at once. The room around him was blurred, colors melting into shapes he couldn't name. But one thing rose through the fog with perfect clarity, a memory that refused to fade. His lips parted, dry and trembling, and a faint whisper escaped, a name, not a plea, not a question, a haunting, Elisa. The sound barely carried, but the weight behind it was heavy enough to anchor him to the truth he wished he could forget. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't disorientation. This was recognition. He remembered the teacup. He remembered the sweet taste she said would help him rest. He remembered dizziness sweeping over him like a collapsing wave. And most painfully of all, he remembered her stepping back instead of reaching for him as his body hit the floor. Waking up from a 10-year coma is shocking. Remembering the person who caused it is something else entirely. Mason didn't wake to a blank slate. He woke to unfinished business. Let me ask you something and be honest with yourself. What would you do if the person you trusted most, someone you shared vows, a home, and a future with, became the source of your deepest wound? How do you make sense of a promise broken so completely? How do you face the memory of someone you once loved working against you? Not through arguments or emotional distance, but through a plan meant to erase you from the world. Have you ever lain awake wondering if you misread someone's heart, or questioned how well you truly know the people closest to you? Because that's the question Mason faced the moment he opened his eyes. While doctors murmured in the background and machines hummed steadily beside him, his mind wasn't focused on his body. It wasn't on the years he'd lost. It wasn't even on the shock of waking at all. His thoughts were fixed on betrayal, on the moment love transformed into something cold and calculated. A decade of silence couldn't soften the memory. If anything, it sharpened it. And now that he was awake, there was no more pretending, no more excuses, no more comforting illusions. The truth waited for him, and he was ready to face it. Here's where the real story begins. Mason didn't just wake up from a coma. He woke up with clarity. He wasn't confused about how he ended up in that hospital. He wasn't piecing together fragments of some hazy accident. He wasn't protected by forgetfulness or uncertainty. He remembered everything. The drink, the bitterness hidden behind honey and warmth, the shift in his wife's eyes. His survival wasn't supposed to happen. His awakening wasn't part of anyone's plan, and the people who heard him had gone on with their lives assuming he'd never open his eyes again. That's what makes this moment powerful, because he survived what should have ended him. He woke up knowing who had tried to take his life, and he woke up with a calm, steady determination that frightened even the doctors watching him. This wasn't the beginning of recovery. This was the beginning of justice, whatever form that would take. A man who comes back from 10 years of forced silence doesn't return the same. He returns with purpose. So here's the real question, the one that brought you here. What does a man do when he wakes up after a decade only to realize the person he once trusted more than anyone betrayed him at the deepest level? Does he break? Does he hide? Does he accept what happened and move on? Or does he follow the truth, step by step, until it leads him directly to the people who thought he'd never rise again? Mason didn't wake up to forgive. He didn't wake up to forget. He woke up because his story wasn't finished. And the moment he whispered Elisa's name, the path ahead became clear. This wasn't just a return to consciousness. It was the first step on a long road toward confronting the woman who tried to take everything from him, and the man who helped her do it. Their choices had shaped the last 10 years of his life. Now he would shape what came next. And trust me, what happened when Mason finally stood face to face with the people who hurt him is something you will not want to miss. Before we move forward into the full story, before we break down what truly happened the night Mason collapsed, how Elisa disappeared after the poisoning, and how Mason eventually found both answers and strength, take a moment to support the channel. Stories like this take time, care, and passion to bring to life. So if you're new here, welcome. If you're returning, thank you for being part of this community. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed and tap the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming stories. Now, let's go back to Cedar Valley, to the life Mason built with love, to the moment it all shattered, and to the long path that eventually led him back to the truth. Thank you for joining me today. Whether you've been part of this channel for a while, or this is your very first time tuning in, I'm truly glad you're here. Every story I share is crafted with care, and this one reaches deep into betrayal, survival, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life after everything falls apart. Mason Wyatt's journey is more than a mystery. It's a reminder that trust can break in an instant, and yet the human spirit has a way of rising, even when the world believes you're finished. As you listen, I want you to place yourself in his position for a moment. What would you do if you woke up from a coma and remembered every detail, every word, every betrayal, every face that wanted you gone? Would you run from the past? Would you confront it? Or would you find a new way forward? Think about that as we continue. And before we move deeper into Mason's story, be sure to subscribe for more true cozy crime stories. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Cedar Valley woke gently each morning, long before the sun fully pulled itself over the horizon. You could hear it in the soft creak of porch swings moving under the weight of early risers sipping warm drinks. These swings weren't decorative pieces, they were part of the town's heartbeat. People used them to greet neighbors, to watch summer storms pass, or simply to let the quiet moments wash over them. Mason's swing was the kind with a slight wobble, repaired so many times it carried its own history. He'd often sit there in the evenings, letting the breeze brush against his face while he sanded small blocks of wood. It was his place of thought, a spot where decisions felt clearer and life felt less complicated. Elisa once told him that the swing made the house feel alive, as if it whispered stories of everyone who ever rested on it. Mason cherished that. For him, the gentle sway meant home, steady, comforting, reliable. Before everything changed, that swing held their laughter. It held their quiet talks. It held the warmth of a future he believed was waiting for them. Mason loved those trees. He used their wood often, transforming fallen limbs into bowls, picture frames, or small carvings he gifted to neighbors. He appreciated how maple was both sturdy and elegant, just like the town he grew up in. During his early years with Elisa, they'd often take walks beneath those trees, watching sunlight filter through the leaves. She once tucked a bright red leaf behind his ear and laughed at how it clashed with his dark hair. He kept that leaf pressed inside a book for years. The maples symbolized change, natural, honest change. Seasons shifted, yet the trees remained rooted and dependable. Mason always saw himself that way too, steady and loyal. He just didn't realize that not everyone shared that same nature. Cedar Valley was the type of place where people didn't need to schedule kindness, it was automatic. Neighbors waved from across lawns, leaving baskets of fresh fruit on porches, helping carry groceries or shoveling snowy driveways without needing to be asked. Mason fit easily into this environment. His easygoing smile made people comfortable. He'd fix a gate, sharpen an old tool, or repair a squeaky floorboard simply because someone mentioned it in passing. Folks trusted him. They confided in him. They brought him pies as thanks and pulled him aside at festivals to tell him how grateful they were for his help. Elisa was welcomed immediately, too. The townspeople were drawn to her quiet charm, her gentle tone, and the way she seemed almost delicate in her movements. Women invited her to craft nights and book clubs. Men offered to carry heavy boxes into her car. Couples invited her and Mason to neighborhood dinners. For a while, everything looked perfect from the outside. Two people embraced by a community that believed in loyalty, honesty, and simple goodness. But as Elisa drifted away emotionally, neighbors sensed something was off. They whispered with concern, not judgment. They wanted the best for Mason. They just didn't know how deep the cracks truly ran. Behind Mason's house sat his pride and joy, a small workshop built from weathered boards, wide windows, and years of dedication. The scent of fresh-cut wood clung to the air around it, creating a smell that neighbors associated with comfort and craftsmanship. Inside, the walls were lined with tools arranged so neatly it looked like a gallery of worn steel and polished handles. Mason knew where every item belonged. He could reach for a chisel in the dark without missing. His workbench was covered with pencil marks, tiny curls of shavings, and half-finished pieces made with patient, steady hands. When he worked, the world faded. The rhythm of his tools brought him peace and clarity. He carved not out of obligation but out of love, the love for creating something lasting. Elisa used to visit him there, resting her head against the doorway, watching him with quiet admiration. He would look up, see her smile, and feel something warm settle in his chest. His workshop wasn't just a place of labor, it was his sanctuary. Losing it later, sold without his consent, cut deeper than Elisa ever realized. Life in Cedar Valley didn't rush. It flowed. Morning started with the clatter of dishes at the local diner, where Mrs. Park served eggs with the same cheer she had for 20 years. Kids rode their bikes along wide streets. Retirees sat outside the general store playing checkers. Even the dog seemed unbothered by the pace, stretching lazily in patches of sunlight. Mason belonged to this rhythm. His days were filled with measured steps, waking early, brewing coffee, working in his shop, sharing meals with Elisa, and taking slow walks through town in the evenings. People often said that you could hear yourself think in Cedar Valley because the world didn't compete for your attention. For Mason, that quietness was a blessing. It made every good thing feel brighter, every small joy feel bigger. This rhythm wrapped around his life like a warm blanket. He believed it would never break, that the steady days would roll on forever. But even the gentlest places cannot protect a person from hidden choices made behind closed doors. Mason Wyatt wasn't a complicated man. He took pride in simple truths: treat people kindly, work with integrity, and speak honestly. His calm nature made others feel understood. He listened more than he talked. He never assumed the worst about anyone. His heart wasn't guarded. It was open. That openness made him beloved in town, but it also made him vulnerable in ways he didn't realize. When he married Elisa, he believed he'd found someone who valued the same things he did. Her gentleness mirrored his own. Her presence softened the edges of his long days. He trusted her completely, with the kind of devotion that isn't loud or boastful. It just is. So when she began to pull away, he didn't confront her. He questioned himself first, wondering what he had done wrong, how he could bring her closer again, how he could protect the future he dreamed of. His emotional grounding made him strong, but it also blinded him to the storm forming right beside him. Where Mason was steady, Elisa was conflicted. Her quiet manner hid a restlessness she rarely admitted. She admired Cedar Valley at first, the calm, the kindness, the slower days, but part of her missed the excitement of her former life in the city. She wanted comfort, stability, and admiration. Yet she also craved novelty and attention. These contradictions created a tension inside her that grew year by year. In the early days, Mason's affection felt like safety. His steady presence gave her a sense of belonging, but as time went on, the predictability that once soothed her began to feel confining. She didn't voice these emotions. She kept them tucked away, allowing them to fester quietly. When Corbin entered her life, confident, bold, full of a charm Cedar Valley rarely saw, he stirred the parts of her she tried to bury. The attention he offered wasn't steady like Mason's. It was exciting, flattering, filled with the thrill she thought she'd left behind. Her emotional imbalance didn't excuse her choices, but it explained the cracks that began to spread beneath the surface long before Mason realized anything was wrong. Mason Wyatt first met Elisa Lebsack on a warm afternoon when the air carried the scent of cut grass and distant chimney smoke. She walked into his workshop holding a cracked piece of wood from her porch swing. The way she carried it, carefully, almost affectionately, caught his attention. He wasn't the type to fall quickly, nor was she the type to flaunt her charm. Their connection grew in small steps. Mason noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear whenever she felt shy. Elisa noticed how Mason always paused before answering, considering his words with quiet care. Their conversations began with simple exchanges about repairs, weather, and town events. Then they stretched into longer talks, her childhood stories, his memories of learning woodworking from his grandfather. Their moments weren't loud or dramatic. They were steady, gentle, and often unplanned. Mason felt a calm draw toward her, like she fit naturally into the rhythm of his days. Elisa found comfort in the stability he offered, the kind she rarely experienced before. Nothing about their romance arrived with force. It grew like morning light, subtle at first, then warm, bright, and impossible to ignore. Elisa wasn't born into small-town life. She grew up in the city, fast lights, crowded sidewalks, constant motion. She knew the hum of traffic better than the rustle of trees. Her mother had owned an old house in Cedar Valley but lived in it only briefly. When her mother passed, Elisa inherited the quiet home tucked behind a row of maple trees. Moving to Cedar Valley was a shift she didn't predict. She had always pictured herself in places with tall buildings and busy streets, but something inside her longed for a break from noise and chaos. Grief nudged her toward change, and the little house her mother left behind felt like a chance to start over. At first, the silence of Cedar Valley unsettled her. Nights felt too quiet. Days felt too slow. She missed the anonymity of city life, where people brushed past each other without a second glance. Yet over time, she found comfort in the slower rhythm. Neighbors learned her name. Strangers greeted her warmly. People cared, not out of obligation, but out of genuine kindness. When Mason began fixing her porch swing, she saw a lifestyle she had only glimpsed in books and movies, one anchored by gentleness and stability. She admired it. She admired him. The city had taught her how to endure. Cedar Valley taught her how to breathe. Their courtship moved from soft smiles to shared dinners, then from dinners to slow walks through the neighborhood. Mason proposed on an evening when the stars sat bright over the valley, and Elisa said yes with tears in her eyes. Nobody questioned their compatibility. They fit together in a way that felt effortless. Their marriage reflected the calm they both cherished. They shared a home filled with warm lamplight, handmade furniture, and the faint aroma of jasmine from Elisa's tea. They weren't a couple fueled by grand gestures. They found intimacy in little interactions, brushing hands while clearing the table, whispering about hopes for the future, or leaning against each other during quiet nights. Mason would wake early to cook breakfast, leaving a plate warm on the counter for Elisa. She'd wander down the hallway in one of his shirts, hair tousled, mumbling a soft thank you as she sipped her tea. At night they'd fall asleep with her head resting on his chest, his hand resting gently on her waist. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was tender. Mason believed tenderness was the foundation of a lasting bond. Elisa believed it too, at least in the beginning. This quiet marriage wrapped Mason in a sense of security he had never questioned. Some moments stayed in Mason's memory long after everything else fractured. He remembered the evenings when Elisa curled up beside him on the porch swing he rebuilt for her. They'd swayed gently as she rested her head on his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. The scent of jasmine from her tea or her lotion, he could never tell which, would cling to him long after they went inside. He remembered how she'd close her eyes while listening to the sounds of nighttime insects and say she felt safe with him. He believed her. Stargazing became their ritual. On clear nights they would slip outside, lie on a blanket in the yard, and stare up at the sky. Mason would point out constellations his grandfather taught him. Elisa would ask questions about the stars, tracing lines in the air with her finger as if connecting dots between distant lights. He loved how she spoke softly during those nights, her voice mellow, unguarded. In those moments, he saw a version of her, untouched by doubts, fears, or hidden desires. She seemed entirely his, and entirely present. These memories didn't fade, even after everything shattered. They lingered in the corners of his mind, shaping the heartbreak that came later. Because love remembered makes betrayal cut deeper. Like many couples, Mason and Elisa spoke often about the future. For them, the idea of children wasn't just fantasy, it was part of the life they hoped to build. They pictured small hands gripping Mason's tools as he taught a son or daughter how to carve wood. They imagined laughter echoing through the rooms of their quiet home. Elisa once told him she wanted a child with his eyes because she loved the calm she saw in them. They discussed baby names during walks. Mason liked traditional ones. Elisa leaned toward softer, more poetic names. They teased each other about whose preferences would win when the time came. Some nights, as they lay in bed, Elisa would place her hand on his chest and whisper about wanting a family sooner rather than later. Mason always smiled and told her he was ready whenever she was. These conversations anchored him. They made him believe their love wasn't just present, it had a future. But as time went on, the tone of those talks changed. Elisa grew distant. She brushed off discussions about children, claiming she wasn't prepared. Mason didn't push. He told himself she needed time, unaware that her heart was already drifting elsewhere. Their dreams waited patiently, only to be left behind. To understand the depth of what came later, you must understand what Mason thought he had. He believed he found a lifelong partner, not perfect, but gentle, supportive, and committed. He built his days around her presence. Their home was filled with soft touches, shared routines, and a tenderness he assumed would carry them through any hardship. Cedar Valley embraced them as the couple who represented quiet devotion. They looked united, steady, hopeful. Mason saw their life as something rooted and unshakable. But beneath the calm surface, cracks formed slowly, ones he couldn't see because he trusted too deeply and loved too purely. Elisa's restlessness grew. Her admiration shifted. The comfort she once found in small-town life began to feel like confinement. Mason mistook her silence for contemplation, unaware that distance had already taken hold. The warmth that once filled their home dimmed piece by piece. Mason felt it but didn't understand it. He believed all love went through phases. He believed closeness would return if he remained patient. He never imagined the woman whose hand he held while stargazing would one day serve him a drink meant to end his life. The contrast between their beginning and their downfall wasn't just sharp. It was devastating. Mason Wyatt built his life around consistency the way other men built theirs around ambition. He woke before sunrise, not because he had to, but because he enjoyed the quiet before the world stirred. His mornings began with the hiss of a kettle, the scrape of a mug sliding across the counter, and the deep inhale of coffee that marked the start of another steady day. After breakfast, he walked to his workshop, where the familiar hum of tools filled the space like a second heartbeat. Each cut, each smooth stroke of sandpaper, each careful stroke of varnish reminded him of the balance he'd created, simple, reliable, and honest. By midday, he often took a break to chat with neighbors, dropping off a finished piece or offering to help with a repair. People trusted him because he showed up, every time, without fail. He returned home in the evenings to the warm glow of lamplight, where Elisa would be preparing tea or reading a book on the sofa. Nights ended with quiet conversations, soft touches, and the belief that tomorrow would look just as peaceful as today. Mason cherished this steady rhythm. It never occurred to him that someone might crave more than the stability he offered. In the beginning, their home felt like a small, tucked-away corner of happiness. Elisa filled it with soft blankets, candles with gentle scents, and the kind of subtle decorations that made every room feel calm and safe. Mason added handmade shelves, polished tables, and small wooden carvings that reflected his craftsmanship. Their evenings carried a comfortable pattern. Mason cooked most nights, enjoying the way Elisa leaned against the counter while sipping tea, telling him small stories from her day, what she read, who she met, or something amusing she overheard in town. After dinner, they washed dishes together, elbows brushing, the warm glow from the kitchen window casting them in a scene that felt almost timeless. Weekends were spent tending the yard, shopping at the local market, or visiting friends. They weren't extravagant or dramatic in how they expressed affection. They simply moved in sync, as if they shared an unspoken language built from soft gestures and familiar smiles. There was nothing flashy about their world, but it was a comfortable one, a home filled with warmth, security, and quiet devotion. Mason believed this was the kind of life people dreamed of. And for a time, Elisa's gentle presence made him sure she felt the same. When Elisa first settled into Cedar Valley, she carried a softness that drew people in. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking. Instead, she spoke with a calm that made others want to lean in and listen. Her humor was dry and subtle, offered in small comments that caught Mason by surprise and left him smiling long after. She often sat by the window with a book resting on her knees, pausing now and then to watch birds flutter near the feeders Mason installed. She took long walks admiring the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. She seemed content with quiet, almost grateful for it, after years of crowded streets and restless nights in the city. Elisa showed affection in small, thoughtful ways. She'd leave notes in Mason's workshop reminding him to eat lunch. She'd bring him fresh tea in the afternoons. She'd nudge his shoulder when he seemed too serious. And at night, she rested against him with a sigh that sounded like relief. Her presence felt gentle, steady, and supportive. Mason believed he had found someone whose heart matched his own, someone who appreciated the peaceful life he offered. He had no way of knowing that stillness could eventually feel like a weight on her shoulders. Elisa's shift didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way a faint draft slips through an open window. Mason didn't recognize it at first. He only noticed subtle changes in her habits. She walked farther than usual on her afternoon strolls. She paused longer at the edge of their driveway before returning inside. She bought new clothes, sleek, modern pieces that contrasted the soft simplicity she once preferred. Her reading choices changed too, moving from calm novels to stories filled with drama and turmoil. There were moments when she stared into the distance, lost in thoughts she never shared. When Mason asked if she was all right, she always gave the same faint smile and said she was just tired. Yet her eyes carried a depth he couldn't interpret. Her restlessness wasn't loud or chaotic. It was quiet, inward, and carefully masked. To most people, she appeared unchanged. But Mason sensed something shifting beneath the surface, even if he couldn't name it. There were times he reached for her hand, and she held it loosely, as though her mind was already somewhere else. He brushed these moments away, believing they were temporary, never imagining they were signs of a deeper drift. Mason had always believed in giving people space when they seemed troubled. He didn't pry. He didn't question motives. He simply trusted that honesty would surface when the moment was right. So when Elisa began to withdraw in small ways, he assumed life's pressures were weighing on her. He made her favorite meals. He cleaned the house to lighten her load. He suggested weekend getaways, though she politely declined, saying she needed time alone. He ignored the tension in her voice during some conversations. He ignored the way she flinched when he surprised her with a hug. He ignored how often she looked at her phone with a guarded expression. He even ignored the nights she claimed she couldn't sleep, choosing the guest room for some quiet. Mason's love made him patient, sometimes to a fault. He convinced himself that every marriage had phases, and he just needed to be steady until hers passed. He didn't want to believe anything was seriously wrong. Acknowledging the distance would have meant facing the fear that their bond wasn't as unshakable as he thought. So he kept offering warmth, hoping it would pull her back. He didn't see that she was drifting further away with each passing day. The cracks revealed themselves in moments so subtle they barely registered at first. Elisa stopped reaching for Mason's hand when they walked together. The spark in her eyes during conversations faded into a distant glaze. Their laughter, once effortless, became rare, replaced by quiet exchanges that felt like they were carefully measured. She spent more time out of the house, claiming errands, book club meetings, or visits with new acquaintances Mason had never met. She grew protective of her privacy, closing doors she once kept open. Sometimes she returned home smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, not hers, but someone else's lingering on her clothes. Mason asked gentle questions, never pushing too hard. Elisa responded with vague reassurances that did little to soothe the growing tightness in his chest. The emotional distance lengthened. Their nightly talks shortened. She turned away in bed, creating a physical divide that echoed the space widening between them. He convinced himself it was stress, or a rough patch, or simply a season of change. He believed love could weather anything if he stayed calm and loyal, but he didn't know that someone else had already slipped into the gaps she created. The normal life he cherished was beginning to fracture, quietly, slowly, invisibly, setting the stage for the heartbreak that would soon follow. It began slowly at first, nights that stretched longer than usual, an absence that drifted in like fog. Mason noticed it in the way Elisa stayed out later than expected. She'd claim it was book club, or a catch-up with friends she hadn't seen in a while, He never questioned it at first, trusting her as he always had. But it became a pattern. The days blended into longer stretches of time without her. She'd leave after dinner, telling him she needed space or that she was meeting someone for a quick chat. When she returned, she was quieter, eyes tired in a way that didn't seem like fatigue from the physical world. Mason would ask about her evening when she walked through the door. Sometimes she'd give him a smile and say everything was fine. Other times, she'd brush off his questions with a vague reply or a distracted laugh. He began to feel the emptiness in their home. It wasn't the silence of peaceful solitude. It was a hollow absence, a space that grew wider each day she wasn't there. Every evening, Mason would sit alone at the dinner table, cleaning up the plates she'd left behind, unsure whether it was his solitude he missed or the person he thought he still knew. It was a scent that hit him before he saw her. One evening, after yet another late return, Elisa walked through the door, and the unmistakable fragrance followed her like an unwelcome shadow. Mason couldn't place it exactly. It wasn't the lavender she used in her bath or the faint floral she'd wear during the day. No, this was different. It was sharper, more exotic, foreign. It didn't seem to bother her. She didn't notice the way Mason paused at the threshold, sniffing the air. She was too focused on slipping off her shoes, too eager to brush past him, her mind already far away. Mason said nothing at first. He convinced himself it was just the result of a busy evening, perhaps a crowded cafe or an overzealous store clerk spraying some new fragrance. But the more he thought about it, the less convinced he became. This perfume wasn't a mistake. It was a mark, one that Elisa had left, perhaps unknowingly, on their home, on their life. For days he wondered if it would be an isolated incident, a one-off encounter with a perfume sample or a misplaced spritz. But the scent lingered, stubborn and unchanged, on the collar of her blouse, on the air around her when she kissed him goodnight. Mason couldn't ignore it any longer, but he couldn't bring himself to ask her either. There was something about it, something in the scent, that told him he didn't want the answer. He wasn't ready to face whatever it was that would inevitably follow. It wasn't just the late nights or the unknown perfume. It was the emotional distance that began to settle between them like a cold fog. Mason couldn't pin down the exact moment it started. It wasn't one argument or one slip of her affection. It was 1,000 tiny moments that added up over time. Elisa no longer reached for his hand when they walked. Their conversations became more surface level. The soft intimacy that once filled their home, the shared smiles, the quiet laughter, the gentle touches, began to evaporate. In its place, there was a subtle tension that Mason couldn't quite shake. He tried to reach out. He tried to reignite the spark they once had. There were nights when he'd planned small surprises, dinners, trips to the lake, quiet walks under the stars. But Elisa never seemed to return the energy. She'd smile, sure, but it wasn't the same. It was as if something was missing, a piece of her he couldn't access anymore. When he asked if something was wrong, Elisa would laugh softly, brushing off his concerns. "I'm just tired," she'd say, "or I've got a lot on my mind." Her voice would carry the familiar warmth, but Mason could hear the distance in it, the space between them that had grown ever wider. The more he tried to close that gap, the further it seemed to grow. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Elisa spoke the words that had been floating between them for weeks, but had never been voiced aloud. It came out in the middle of an otherwise mundane conversation, a remark so quiet it almost slipped by unnoticed. "Mason, I think I need to figure out who I am," she said, not looking at him. Her fingers traced the edge of her teacup, the motion slow and deliberate. He blinked, the words hanging in the air like a curtain he wasn't sure how to pull back. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice unsure. "I don't know, I feel lost sometimes, like I'm living a life that isn't mine, and I need to figure it out." Her words were soft, but they struck him with a force he didn't expect. The idea that Elisa, his Elisa, the woman who had promised him forever, was feeling like this, so adrift, confused him and hurt him in equal measure. She was searching for herself, she said, but in doing so, she was pulling away from him. Whether intentionally or not, he couldn't tell. Mason tried to understand. He nodded, holding back the unease that crawled up his spine. "You're still you, Elisa," he said, though he wasn't sure who that you was anymore. "I don't know if I am," she whispered, more to herself than to him. In that moment, Mason felt a subtle, chilling truth. He wasn't sure who she was either. The weeks that followed were marked by a growing sense of confusion and hurt. Mason watched as Elisa withdrew into herself, leaving him on the outside looking in. The woman he once knew so well was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. He couldn't ignore the way her eyes lost the spark they once had when they looked at him. He couldn't ignore the awkward silences during dinner, the way her laughter no longer reached her eyes. He couldn't ignore the absence of affection in the little things, the touches, the smiles, the quiet moments of closeness. Mason tried to hold on to her, reaching out in ways he thought might bring her back. But with each effort he felt like he was grasping at air. Every step closer he took seemed to push her further away. He spent his nights lying awake, questioning everything. Was it something he had done? Had he changed in some way he couldn't see? Or was it her? Had she always been like this, hiding parts of herself he'd never known? The confusion gnawed at him. His heart, once so full of certainty, was now heavy with doubt. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure if he even wanted to know the truth. One evening, after a particularly tense silence between them, Mason reached for Elisa's hand as they sat on the couch. She stiffened slightly before letting him hold it, but the warmth he'd once felt was gone. There was a coldness to her touch, like she was physically separating herself from him. Mason's heart sank. He tried to ignore the small voice in his head that told him she was slipping away, but the distance between them was becoming impossible to overlook. Elisa began to retreat to the guest room more often, claiming she couldn't sleep. At first Mason had believed her, but now he wondered if she was withdrawing from him, not just emotionally but physically as well. When he kissed her goodnight, her lips were soft, but her eyes were distant, almost like she was looking past him. His arms no longer felt like her refuge, they felt like a formality. The more he reached for her, the more she pulled away. Mason didn't know how to bridge the gap. He didn't know how to fix something that wasn't broken in any traditional sense but was fractured all the same. He was losing her, and no amount of love, patience, or effort seemed to be enough. Corbin Hale arrived in Cedar Valley the way a gust of wind slips through an open window, unexpected, unannounced, and instantly noticeable. He rented a cabin by the lake, claiming he needed a break from city life. Unlike the locals, who dressed in simple jeans and worn boots, Corbin carried himself with an air of practiced confidence. His clothes were crisp, his hair trimmed with precision, his posture tall and commanding. He had a way of speaking that made people feel like he was granting them attention rather than sharing a conversation. Some found him charming, others found him too polished to be genuine. But regardless of opinion, one thing was certain: Corbin drew eyes wherever he went. He frequented the lakeside cafe most mornings, ordering espresso with a tone that suggested he expected perfection. He spoke to the barista in a friendly but overly familiar manner. He smiled easily, though his smile never quite reached his eyes. When newcomers passed through town, Corbin greeted them like he'd lived there his whole life. People wondered what brought him to their quiet valley. He never gave the same story twice. Some days he said he worked remotely in finance, other days he claimed to be writing a book. Mason noticed the inconsistencies, though at the time they didn't concern him. Corbin was the kind of man who knew how to blend charm with mystery, a combination powerful enough to turn heads, especially someone already drifting away from her marriage. But Mason wouldn't understand that part until it was too late. Cedar Valley wasn't the kind of town where secrets stayed buried for long. Conversations traveled easily, from the diner counter to the grocery store aisles, from the barber shop to the farmer's market. People talked not out of malice, but out of habit. It was simply how information moved. So when residents began noticing Elisa spending more time near the lake, sometimes with Corbin, whispers followed. Not loud ones, not malicious ones, just quiet exchanges between neighbors who had always cared deeply about Mason. "Have you seen Elisa at the cafe lately? She was with that new fellow, what's his name? Corbin. Maybe they're just friends. Maybe." Nobody brought these murmurs to Mason directly. They assumed he already knew. Or they assumed Elisa had a reasonable explanation. After all, from the outside, Mason and Elisa still appeared to be a united pair, though less affectionate than before. Still, the whispers grew. Someone mentioned seeing Elisa and Corbin sharing a long conversation near the water. Another claimed Elisa had changed her hairstyle after Corbin complimented her during a chance meeting. Yet another noted that Corbin seemed to just happen to be around whenever Elisa visited certain places. Mason heard none of this at first. The people of Cedar Valley respected him too much to feed him gossip. They believed in giving him the benefit of the doubt, but rumors don't dissipate without reason. They settle into the air like dust, waiting for the truth to catch up. And in Cedar Valley, the truth had begun to stir. Mason didn't notice the shift at first. Elisa had always carried a quiet beauty, but recently she seemed to shine in a way he couldn't quite explain. She dressed differently, more deliberately, choosing outfits with colors that highlighted her features. She styled her hair with a level of care she hadn't shown in months. Even her posture felt transformed, her shoulders held back with a confidence he didn't recognize. When she returned from her outings, there was a spark in her eyes, not a spark of affection for Mason, but of excitement she couldn't contain. She'd hum while preparing tea or drift through rooms with a light step that contrasted sharply with the heaviness she'd shown around him. Mason wanted to believe she was simply finding herself again. He clung to the idea that maybe she was entering a new phase of growth, but then he noticed the timing. She seemed happiest after she'd gone near the lake. She smiled more after evenings she claimed were spent with friends from book club. She glowed in ways he didn't inspire anymore, though he tried. One afternoon, she walked into the house with a soft blush on her cheeks. Mason had just finished sanding a piece of walnut wood. He looked up, and for a split second, she didn't notice him watching. Her expression was open and joyful, her eyes dancing as though recalling something recent and pleasant. But when she saw him, the light dimmed instantly. She slipped into a neutral smile, the kind that carried politeness but not warmth. It was in that moment Mason felt the shift he'd been trying to ignore settle into something undeniable. Mason wasn't a man quick to suspect. His heart wasn't wired for distrust. He'd built his life on the belief that love could weather uncertainty and that honesty would always rise above confusion. So when Elisa's behavior grew more unusual, he constructed explanations that softened the truth. He told himself she was overwhelmed. He convinced himself she was exploring new friendships. He wanted to believe she was rediscovering parts of herself, parts she would eventually bring back to their marriage. He brushed aside the late nights. He disregarded the new perfume. He dismissed the spark in her eyes when she returned from the lake. Mason clung to the hope that this was a temporary shift. He worried that confronting her too soon would push her further away. The thought of accusing her felt wrong, like violating the foundation their marriage was built on. He reasoned that if something was truly wrong, she would tell him in her own time. But beneath the denial sat a familiar ache, an ache he tried to bury under chores, woodworking, long showers, and forced calm. Late at night, he'd lie awake beside her, listening to her steady breathing and wondering if he was losing her. Sometimes he'd reach out to touch her arm, only for his hand to freeze midair. Mason wasn't ready to face the truth, not because he couldn't handle it, but because accepting it meant acknowledging that the love he cherished might already be slipping beyond his reach. The night he followed Elisa wasn't born from suspicion. It was born from fear. Fear that he was losing something precious. Fear that silence had become a wall between them. Fear that he was no longer part of her world. She told him she had a late meeting with her book club. Her voice was steady, but her eyes didn't linger on his the way they used to. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a soft, flowing one that complemented her figure more than her usual choices. When she left, Mason stood inside the doorway, listening to the sound of her car pulling away. Something inside him tightened. He grabbed his keys without thinking, his hands trembling as he started the truck. He followed at a distance, careful enough not to draw attention. The drive toward the lake felt long and quiet, the hum of the engine blending with his racing heartbeat. When Elisa turned off toward the cabin-lined shore, Mason's stomach sank. There were no book clubs near the water, just secluded paths and dimly lit docks. He parked behind a cluster of trees, stepping out quietly. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying faint sounds of laughter. Each step toward the lake felt heavier than the last. He walked with caution, staying hidden, fearing what he might see but needing to know. The moonlight hung over the water, and far ahead, beside a bench near the pier, stood two silhouettes, close enough to touch. Mason stopped in his tracks. There, in the soft glow of the moon, he saw Elisa standing inches from Corbin Hale. Her posture was relaxed, more relaxed than Mason had seen in months. Her shoulders weren't tense, her smile wasn't forced. She looked free, and that truth hit Mason harder than anything else. Corbin leaned forward, speaking in a low voice only she could hear. She laughed softly, a sound Mason hadn't heard in so long it felt foreign. Corbin brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and she didn't flinch. She leaned into the gesture. Mason's breath caught. He felt his chest tighten, each heartbeat echoing like distant thunder. He wanted to look away, but his body refused to move. Then it happened. Corbin cupped her cheek gently, tilting her face upward. Elisa didn't step back. She didn't hesitate. Her eyes fluttered shut and her lips met with a tenderness that shattered the last thread of hope Mason had been clinging to. It wasn't a passionate, reckless kiss. It was soft, deliberate, familiar. The kind of kiss shared by two people who had already crossed a line long before their lips touched. Mason's legs felt weak. His hands shook. The world around him blurred, but the image of them together remained painfully clear. He had come seeking reassurance. Instead, he found confirmation of his worst fear. The woman he loved had given her heart to another man. Mason didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't confront them. The moment he saw the kiss, something inside him shut down, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating finality. He turned away from the lake, his footsteps slow and heavy. Every sound felt amplified, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the distant rustling of branches, the low murmur of water hitting the shore. The night seemed colder, sharper, as though the air itself recognized his pain. He walked back to his truck with a sense of detachment, moving as if his body existed separately from his emotions. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, yet he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, staring into the darkness, letting the weight of what he'd witnessed settle over him like a thick, suffocating blanket. When he finally drove home, the road blurred through his tears, not tears of anger, but tears born from heartbreak and disbelief. He kept wiping them away quickly, as if he didn't want to acknowledge they existed. By the time he reached the house, he felt hollow. He walked inside quietly, taking in the silence that greeted him. Their home, once warm and filled with shared memories, felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. He sank onto the worn couch, staring at the door she would eventually walk through. He didn't know what he would say when she returned. He wasn't even sure he had the strength to speak at all. The hardest part wasn't the kiss. It was realizing that even after witnessing it, he still loved her. Sitting alone in the quiet of their home, Mason felt a mixture of emotions battling inside him. Hurt clawed at his chest, raw and immediate. Confusion weighed heavily on his mind, trying to make sense of a situation that felt unreal. But beneath it all, there remained an ache that refused to fade, a longing for the woman he believed Elisa once was. He hated himself for it. He hated that his heart didn't match the truth his eyes had shown him. He wanted to feel anger. He wanted to slam doors, break something, let the rage swallow the pain. But he couldn't, not yet. Instead, he remembered the small moments, her laughter on quiet nights, her hand slipping into his during walks, the way she once said his presence made her feel grounded. He clung to those memories as though they could explain away the betrayal. He wondered what drove her to seek comfort elsewhere. Was it something he'd done? Was he not enough? Had he missed signs that were there from the beginning? The questions twisted through his mind, pulling him deeper into doubt. But even as the pain intensified, he couldn't escape one simple truth. His heart still recognized her as his wife, and loving someone who hurt you without mercy is its own kind of suffering, one that leaves scars deeper than any physical wound. Corbin Hale knew how to read people. It was one of his most practiced talents, spotting insecurities, noticing cracks beneath calm expressions and gently prying them open until he gained full access. When he first began spending time with Elisa, he treated her like a puzzle he wanted to solve. He observed everything. The way she hesitated before speaking about her marriage, the way she looked away when he complimented her, the subtle hints of dissatisfaction she tried to hide. He played his role flawlessly. Whenever Elisa mentioned Mason, Corbin leaned in with concern, acting as though her unhappiness affected him personally. He phrased his questions carefully, steering her emotions without appearing to influence them. "Are you truly happy?" he'd ask softly, eyes trained on her face. "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that isn't yours?" Elisa often tried to defend her marriage, but her defenses were thin. Corbin sensed it. He learned when to push and when to stay silent. He made her feel understood, something he knew she craved. He was patient, letting her unravel herself in front of him, piece by piece. Then came the subtle undermining. "He seems like a good man," Corbin would say thoughtfully, "but good doesn't always mean right for you, or comfort can feel like love when you don't know the difference." Elisa absorbed his words like someone starved for validation. Corbin saw the shift in her immediately, the way she leaned on his approval, the way she glowed when he affirmed her feelings. By the time she realized she was tangled in his influence, Corbin had already woven himself deeply into her emotional world, and from there, it was an easy step for him to steer her toward far darker territory. Elisa's life with Mason wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. She had a roof over her head, meals cooked with care, a husband who adored her, and a community that treated her like family. Even when she drifted from him emotionally, she still depended on the security he provided. This dependency haunted her. The more she fell into Corbin's orbit, the more she feared what leaving Mason would cost her. The house, the finances, the respect of Cedar Valley, none of it would remain if she walked away openly. Divorce meant confrontation, judgment, and potential loss. It meant losing the cushion that Mason's loyalty had always given her. Corbin noticed this fear and used it to his advantage. During quiet moments at the lake, when Elisa wrestled with her guilt, he would speak softly, his voice gentle yet calculated. "You deserve a life that matches who you're becoming," he'd say, "but you can't get there if you're tied down." She'd shake her head, conflicted. "Leaving him would destroy everything," she whispered once, tears filling her eyes. "I can't start from nothing." Corbin placed a hand on her back. "You're not starting from nothing," he said. "You'd have me." But even his promise of a future together didn't soothe her entirely. She wanted freedom, but she also wanted to keep the comfort Mason unknowingly provided. She wanted both safety and passion, both stability and excitement. And deep down, she knew she couldn't have all of it, not honestly. It was that internal tug of war, that fear of stepping into an uncertain future, that made her vulnerable to the darkest idea Corbin planted. A way to end her marriage without losing the life she depended on. A way to walk forward without looking back. A way to erase Mason without ever having to confront him. The idea wasn't spoken aloud at first. It lingered between them during late-night conversations, in the quiet glances they exchanged, in the tension that hovered whenever Mason's name surfaced. Corbin was careful. He didn't push too fast. He let the thought grow slowly, feeding it in small increments until it became something Elisa couldn't unhear. One evening, they sat inside Corbin's cabin, the glow from a single lamp casting a soft warmth across the room. Elisa had her knees pulled to her chest, staring out the window. She looked fragile, torn between guilt and desire, between what she wanted and what she feared she couldn't escape. "I can't keep living like this," she murmured. "I feel trapped." Corbin placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be," he said gently. She sighed. "You don't understand. Mason gave me everything. I can't just walk away and act like none of it mattered." Corbin paused, studying her expression before speaking. "There are ways to move on," he said carefully, "without losing everything you've built." She turned toward him slowly. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. He let the silence do the work, let her fill in the blanks. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "If his life changed," Corbin said, "you'd be free. You wouldn't have to choose between comfort and happiness." Her breath hitched. She stared at him, unspoken terror flickering in her eyes. "I'm not talking about anything dramatic," he added smoothly. "Just a natural shift, something no one could question." She hesitated. "I can't." "You're not alone," Corbin said, squeezing her hand. "I'll help you." That was the moment the unthinkable took root. Not fully, not clearly, but it took root. From then on, their conversations grew darker, quieter, more deliberate. Whispered plans exchanged in secret corners, timelines discussed in hushed voices, boundaries crossed one suggestion at a time. By the time they finally spoke the idea aloud, guilt had already given way to grim resolve. The poison entered their plan through a seemingly innocent suggestion. Corbin introduced it casually, as though talking about herbal supplements he'd read about online. He brought a small vial of clear liquid one evening, placing it gently on the wooden table between them. "This isn't dramatic," he said. "It mimics exhaustion, maybe a fainting spell. Small doses over time. Nothing suspicious. Elisa stared at the vial, her breath shallow. "What is it?" she whispered. "Something subtle," Corbin replied. "Something that looks like nature taking its course." He explained it in simple terms. No technical jargon, just the reassurance she needed. The idea wasn't to kill Mason quickly. A sudden death would raise questions. But a slow decline, a gradual weakening that resembled illness, that would attract far less scrutiny. "He's been tired lately, hasn't he?" Corbin asked. Elisa swallowed hard. "Yes, then this fits," Corbin said. "A gentle solution for a painful problem." She flinched at the word solution, but he continued coaxing her. "You can mix it with tea," he said. "Give it to him at night. It's harmless in tiny amounts. He'll only think he's tired." Elisa wanted to walk away from the plan. She truly did. But the longer she stared at the vial, the more she felt its presence soothing her fear of confrontation. It offered escape without the cost of honesty. It offered a clean break without the mess of divorce. That night, she took the vial home, hiding it in her purse. Mason greeted her with a gentle smile, unaware of the plan now entering his home. "Rough day?" he asked. She nodded, forcing a smile. "You could say that." And so the excuse formed, a sleep remedy, something natural, something to help him relax. It was the perfect disguise. Once the plan was in motion, both Corbin and Elisa built their own narratives to justify the growing darkness. Corbin told himself he was helping Elisa escape a life she didn't want. In his mind, Mason was an obstacle, kind perhaps, but still in the way. Corbin saw himself as the answer to Elisa's unhappiness. He framed the plan as an act of liberation, not violence. "He'll drift away peacefully," Corbin reassured her. "No suffering, no chaos." For Corbin, the justification wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. If Mason disappeared, Elisa would inherit the house, the workshop, the savings. Their future wouldn't just be free of complications, it would be financially secure. Elisa's justification was more tragic. She convinced herself that Mason deserved someone who loved him fully, something she believed she could never offer again. She told herself that her guilt was proof she wasn't heartless. She imagined Mason drifting away quietly, still believing she cared, sparing both of them the pain of a brutal separation. It wasn't rational, but guilt rarely is. "I'm sparing him from heartbreak," she whispered to herself one night, staring into the bathroom mirror. "He won't have to see me leave." She began viewing Mason's kindness as a weight, something that bound her to a life she no longer recognized. "I can't hurt him with the truth," she told Corbin. "And you won't," Corbin answered. "This is merciful." Their shared delusion twisted reality until both could pretend their actions made sense. They clung to the idea that their intentions were gentle, even as the steps they took grew crueler by the day. Slowly, their moral boundaries eroded. What once felt unthinkable began to feel inevitable. Mason's trust, his affection, his fragile hope, none of it was enough to stop them. As the plan solidified, everything became disturbingly orderly. Corbin handled the logistics. He measured doses, created a schedule, and coached Elisa on how to disguise any symptoms Mason might show. "A headache here, a little fatigue there," he explained. "It'll look natural." Elisa memorized every instruction. She practiced stirring tea without trembling, practiced smiling when Mason thanked her, practiced placing the cup in front of him without hesitation. Each night, she added a barely visible drop to the cup. Mason drank it without a second thought, grateful for the tenderness he believed was returning. "You always take care of me," he said once, kissing her forehead. Elisa's heart clenched, but she pushed the feeling down. She reminded herself that this was temporary, that soon she would step into a life where she no longer had to pretend. Corbin remained detached. He monitored their progress like a distant overseer, asking Elisa for updates with an unnerving calm. "He'll weaken slowly." "That's what we want," he said. "You're doing the right thing." Her trembling hands told a different story. As days passed, Mason began feeling unusually tired. He stumbled once while working, brushing it off as lack of sleep. When Elisa offered more tea to help him relax, he smiled warmly and accepted. The coldness of the plan sharpened. Elisa began locking away evidence. She staged her concern perfectly, calling Mason's name softly when he seemed dizzy, pretending to worry about his long hours in the workshop. She rehearsed her future responses to the paramedics. She practiced her tearful voice. She even imagined what she'd say when neighbors came by with condolences. By then, the guilt was muted, overshadowed by the momentum of the plan. Once a line is crossed, the next one appears closer and easier. They had entered a point of no return, and Mason, trusting and unaware, stepped toward his fate with a tenderness that made the betrayal even colder. The evening air settled softly over Cedar Valley, brushing through the open kitchen window as Mason stood at the stove preparing dinner. He hummed under his breath, an old tune his grandfather used to whistle, while steam drifted upward from a pot of simmering vegetables. Tonight, he wanted to make something special, not extravagant but comforting, familiar, something that might draw Elisa back into the warmth they once shared. He set the table with the good plates, the ones they rarely used, and folded the napkins neatly beside them. He lit 2 small candles, hoping their gentle glow would soften whatever distance still lingered between them. As he plated the food, he remembered the early days of their marriage, when Elisa would wrap her arms around his waist from behind while he cooked, laughing as she stole bites of whatever he was preparing. Those moments felt far away now, but Mason believed this dinner might help bridge the gap. He glanced at the clock and exhaled, steadying himself. When Elisa finally walked in, her expression unreadable, he greeted her with a soft smile. "I made your favorite," he said. He hoped she could feel the sincerity in every word. Elisa pushed the food around her plate more than she ate it, but she complimented the meal enough to soothe Mason's nerves. He watched her carefully, searching her face for any sign of affection, any flicker of the woman he once knew so well. After dinner, she excused herself to the kitchen. "I'll make tea," she said quietly. Mason nodded, unaware of the tension tightening her shoulders as she stepped away. Inside the kitchen, Elisa moved with controlled precision. She filled the kettle, placed it on the stove, and reached into her purse with shaking hands. The small vial felt cold against her skin. She hesitated only for a moment, long enough for guilt to rise, but not long enough to stop her. She added honey to both cups, stirring slowly. Then, with a deep breath, she unscrewed the vial and let a few drops fall into one cup. The liquid disappeared instantly, blending into the tea without a trace. Her hands trembled as she lifted the mug meant for Mason. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply as if bracing for the weight of her choice. When she returned to the dining room, her face was composed again, the mask restored. "Here," she said softly, placing the cup before him. Mason looked up at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. She rarely spoke that gently anymore. As he reached for the cup, Elisa leaned down and pressed a tender kiss to his cheek, the kind of affectionate gesture he hadn't felt from her in months. The touch stunned him. It was warm, familiar, filled with the echo of the love he'd been aching to feel again. His breath caught in his throat. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself savor the closeness, hoping it signaled a shift back toward the life they'd once shared. Elisa stepped back, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mason didn't notice the strain, he only saw the possibility of hope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze for too long. "You've been working so hard lately," she murmured. "This will help you rest." Mason lifted the mug, grateful for the sudden spark of tenderness. He believed she was trying. He believed this was the beginning of healing. He drank slowly, unaware that this small moment of affection was the final piece she needed to steady her resolve. At first, the tea felt warm and soothing as it slid down Mason's throat. He set the mug down gently and let out a relaxed sigh. Elisa watched him with controlled focus, her fingers laced tightly together to keep them from trembling. Within minutes, a wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision blurred, as if a thin layer of fog had settled across his eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear it, but the room seemed to tilt, the walls breathing in and out around him. "Elisa," he murmured, voice strained. "Something's wrong." His hand reached out, searching for her, but she stepped back instinctively, unable to move toward him. Her breath hitched as she watched him sway, his knees buckling beneath him. He gripped the table for balance, but his strength gave out. He hit the floor hard, the candlelight flickering above him. "Elisa, help. I don't feel—" His words dissolved into slurred whispers. His body went limp, heavy and unresponsive. His eyes, once so full of trust, clouded over with confusion and fear as he stared up at her. And she just stood there. Her face remained disturbingly neutral, not angry, not panicked, not grieving, just empty, a blank expression masking the turmoil buried deep inside her. She didn't rush to his side. She didn't touch him. She didn't call his name again. She merely watched, breathing slowly, allowing the distance between them to become an irreversible divide. The candles flickered. The house fell silent. Mason's world drifted into darkness, a darkness she helped create. As Mason lay unconscious on the floor, Elisa took a single step backward, one small movement that confirmed she had crossed the point of no return. Whatever love remained between them was overshadowed by the choices she'd made. The man who trusted her completely now lay helpless at her feet, unaware of the storm that had been brewing, behind every whispered lie and every distant glance. Before we continue into the aftermath of this heartbreaking night, I want to hear from you. Who do you think is more dangerous, Elisa or Corbin? Let me know in the comments. Your thoughts add depth to this community and guide how we explore these complex stories. And while you're here, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next in Mason's journey. Because the moment he collapsed wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a chain of events no one in Cedar Valley could have predicted. When paramedics finally arrived hours later, Mason's body was cold to the touch, his breathing shallow and unsteady. They rushed him into the ambulance, their voices sharp with urgency as they checked his pulse and oxygen levels. His skin was pale, lips tinted blue, and his heartbeat fluttered weakly beneath the monitors. The poison had done its job quietly. It had drained his strength, dulled his awareness, and pushed him dangerously close to the edge of death. Doctors worked through the night. Tubes were inserted, fluids pumped in, medications administered in desperate attempts to counteract the unknown substance inside him. Test after test revealed the damage spreading through his system. His nervous system flickered like a dying light bulb. His muscles lost responsiveness. By morning, Mason lay motionless in the hospital bed, kept alive by machines and the unwavering focus of medical staff. The doctors spoke in careful tones. Phrases like critical condition and unresponsive floated through the halls. No one could identify the exact toxin, only that it had taken a severe toll. They listed possibilities, unsure which would help him recover. Mason seemed suspended between two worlds, one where life still held a fragile grip, and another where the darkness from that night called him deeper. Yet his heart kept beating, weak, irregular, but determined. Something inside him refused to give up. It was as though a small piece of Mason's spirit, steadfast, gentle, resilient, held on with everything it had left. Elisa stood by his bedside the first day, but not with the worry one might expect from a spouse. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, her eyes scanning the monitors more than his face. When doctors asked her questions, she answered quickly, distantly, never once calling him a pet name or reaching for his hand. "Did he have any recent illnesses?" they asked. "Not that I know of," she replied flatly. "Did he take any herbal supplements?" "No." "Has he been under unusual stress?" "I don't think so." Her answers held no warmth, no trembling concern, no instinctive affection. To the staff, she simply looked overwhelmed. To anyone who truly knew love, it was absence disguised as composure. By the second day, she returned only briefly. She sat in the corner of the room, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone. When the nurse suggested she talk to him, "Sometimes they can hear you, even if they don't respond," Elisa forced a smile and approached the bed. "Mason, get better," she said softly, but her eyes didn't match the words. She didn't linger, didn't touch him, didn't whisper anything only he would understand. On the third day, she didn't come at all, and by the end of the week, Elisa had vanished entirely. No message for the hospital, no update for family, no sign of remorse. She left him in a sterile room surrounded by strangers and stepped back into the life she'd chosen without him. Within weeks of his hospitalization, Elisa acted swiftly, far more swiftly than anyone expected. She met with a realtor to discuss selling the house. Mason's home, the place he built piece by piece through years of hard work, was suddenly listed on the market with a terse signature and a forged urgency. She cleared out the workshop with alarming efficiency. Wooden carvings he spent months perfecting were tossed carelessly into boxes. Tools he'd inherited from his grandfather were sold for far less than their worth. The workshop, once alive with the warm scent of cedar and walnut, was stripped down until it resembled an empty storage shed. Neighbors watched, perplexed, as trucks hauled away Mason's belongings. Some approached Elisa gently. "Are you sure this is the right time?" one asked. "I need to downsize," she answered curtly. Another neighbor offered help, assuming she was overwhelmed. She declined quickly. "I'm fine," but her eyes were cold, focused more on efficiency than emotion. Every item removed felt like a piece of Mason's life being erased. His memories, his routines, his pride, all reduced to a paper trail and a stack of unsigned checks. When the sale finalized, the locks were changed. The workshop lights were turned off for the last time. His home, once filled with love, quiet conversations and gentle rhythms, was gone. Elisa didn't keep a single thing that belonged to him, not a photo, not a carving, not even his wedding band. She shed his past as if it weighed her down, never once considering that she was dismantling the life of a man still fighting to breathe. Once the house was sold and the accounts emptied, Elisa vanished from Cedar Valley. The departure wasn't dramatic. There was no farewell letter, no explanation to friends, no emotional closure. She packed a small suitcase, met Corbin by the lake, and drove away in the middle of the night. They didn't go far at first, just to a neighboring county where no one knew their faces. Corbin secured a short-term rental and spoke excitedly about starting fresh. He talked about plans, new identities, a future free from judgment. But Elisa's mood shifted as soon as Cedar Valley disappeared from view. Freedom felt different than she imagined. Instead of relief, she felt a weight settle in her stomach. Corbin continued spinning fantasies of the life they'd build together, but she barely listened. The reality of what she'd done clung to her, whispering beneath every breath. Corbin mistook her quietness for guilt and tried to soothe her. "You made the right choice," he said one night. "Your old life was suffocating you." She nodded, but her eyes remained distant. Weeks passed. They moved again, this time farther, settling in a town where no one questioned their past. But the cracks in their partnership grew quickly. Corbin's charm dimmed. Arguments erupted. Their visions for the future didn't match. And Elisa, no longer tethered to Mason's steadiness, felt lost. Eventually, the fights became too frequent. She packed her things quietly once again and left Corbin without a word. She abandoned him just as easily as she had abandoned Mason. As the months turned into years, the world around Mason shifted without him. His friends visited at first, their voices filled with hope. They brought flowers, cards, and stories from Cedar Valley. They spoke to him as though he might open his eyes at any moment. But over time, life resumed for them. Birthdays came and went. Children grew. People moved. New routines replaced old ones. Their visits became less frequent. Then the holidays passed with only a card left by the nurse's station. Then once-a-year drop-ins. Then silence. Cedar Valley, once a place where neighbors had leaned over fences to share news and warm greetings, gradually stopped mentioning Mason. Not out of cruelty, but because life has a way of swallowing time. Only a few remembered him with any depth. Others recalled him as a gentle man who simply went away one day. His workshop stood empty. The porch swing he fixed so lovingly for Elisa belonged to strangers. The house where laughter once echoed now held different voices, unaware of the life that once flourished there. Mason existed as a footnote in a town that moved forward. A quiet man, a tragic accident, a life paused indefinitely. But somewhere beyond that collective forgetting, one person refused to let his memory fade. Arlena Wyatt, Mason's older sister, carried his memory like a responsibility wrapped around her heart. She refused to believe her brother's life had been reduced to a hospital bed and faded conversations. She visited him every week without fail, even when doctors warned her not to expect miracles. She brought fresh flowers, replacing the vase before the petals wilted. She read him letters from neighbors who still cared, even if they didn't visit. She decorated his room on holidays, twinkling lights for winter, paper hearts for early spring, small flags for summer celebrations. She kept photos of him smiling tacked to the bulletin board beside his bed so the nurses would see the man he was, not the motionless figure lying before them. Arlena spoke to him as though he were listening, updating him on family news, town gossip, even the weather. She told him about the home he no longer lived in, hoping one day he'd return and make it his again. She talked about their childhood, how he used to fix her toys when they broke, how he carved her first wooden jewelry box at age 9. She even brought him recordings of music he loved, letting soft melodies fill the room, The nurses often paused in the doorway, touched by her loyalty. Arlena believed, truly believed, that Mason could still hear her. Faith, she said, wasn't a guarantee of results. It was a commitment, and she committed her entire heart to keeping his story alive. Callie Wren joined the long-term care facility 2 years after Mason was admitted. She was soft-spoken, steady-handed, and known for her ability to bring calm to the most difficult days. When she was assigned to Mason, she didn't treat him like a patient lost in silence. She treated him like a person with a life paused, not ended. She brushed his hair carefully, trimmed his nails, and moisturized his hands so they wouldn't dry from disuse. She moved his limbs gently to prevent stiffness, humming softly during each session. She read to him in the evenings, classic novels, light-hearted stories, anything she thought might comfort him. Callia spoke to him as though he were awake. "How's your day going, Mason?" she'd say as she adjusted his blankets. "You should have seen the sunset outside. Bright orange, you would have liked it." Even when she worked long shifts, she made time to check on him. She added small touches to his room, a potted plant, a soft blue blanket, a wind chime near the window to catch the breeze. The staff noticed the change. Mason's room felt warmer, brighter, more lived in. Callia believed that connection mattered, even if the person couldn't respond. People feel things, she often said, even in silence, and though she didn't know it yet, her kindness was reaching Mason in ways no one else could. The passing years painted their rhythm onto the world outside Mason's window. Spring brought bursts of green that peeked through the glass. Nurses opened the curtains wider so sunlight could warm his room. Birds gathered near the ledge, chirping melodies that filled the otherwise quiet space. Summer followed with golden afternoons. The facility buzzed with activity, families visiting loved ones, children running through the courtyard, the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting indoors. Callia often cracked the window slightly so Mason could feel the warm air on his skin. Autumn returned with its reds and golds, leaves falling like fragments of time drifting gently to the earth. Arlena brought him maple branches, placing them in jars beside his bed. "Your favorite season, Mace," she whispered each year. Winter settled in with its stillness. Snow blanketed the courtyard, muffling sounds and creating a calm Mason would have found familiar. Callia laid an extra blanket across him, humming faintly in the dim glow of holiday lights. Year after year, the seasons moved with quiet insistence, marking the time Mason couldn't. His body rested. His mind floated somewhere distant, unreachable. His heart continued its slow, determined beat. Though the world outside shifted constantly, his existence remained unchanged, until the day something flickered behind his closed eyes, a subtle hint that the world might soon welcome him back. 10 years passed in this rhythm, years filled with fading memories, stubborn loyalty, and a gentle voice that refused to stop speaking to him. Mason lay silent, yet not forgotten. Not entirely. There was melancholy in the long stretch of stillness, in the way his body thinned, in the way his hands, once so capable, now rested motionless on clean white sheets. The world he knew had moved on, reshaped itself without him. The house he loved was gone. The marriage he cherished had ended in betrayal. The workshop he built with pride existed only in fading photographs. But there was also hope, quiet, patient, enduring hope. Hope in Arlena's steady devotion, hope in Callia's tender care, hope in the unwavering beat of Mason's heart, refusing to let go, and hope in the small, almost imperceptible changes that only someone truly attentive would notice. A flutter of his eyelids, a twitch in his fingers, a shift in his breathing when Callia played his favorite music. It was Callia who saw the first real sign. One morning as she adjusted his pillow, Mason's fingers curled weakly around hers. She froze, breath catching in her throat. "Mason?" she whispered. His eyelids trembled. Once, twice, then slowly they opened. And for the first time in a decade, Mason Wyatt returned to the world. For 10 years, Mason existed in a world without sound, without light, without form. A world where moments dissolved before he could identify them, drifting somewhere between memory and oblivion. But on a quiet morning, when the sun rose gently and the hallway outside his room hummed with soft conversation, something inside him stirred. It began with a flicker in the deep recesses of his mind, a sensation that felt foreign, as if a distant door had opened. His body remained still, but his awareness shifted, pulling him upward from the depths where he'd been submerged for so long. Then, with great effort, his eyelids trembled. A soft glow filtered through his lashes. A shape formed, then another. His heart beat harder, fighting through the fog. His breathing changed, slow at first, then uneven, as though his lungs were trying to remember their role in the waking world. Finally, after a decade of darkness, Mason's eyes opened. The room was blurry, washed in morning light. Shadows blurred into one another. It didn't make sense at first. Nothing did. But the world, real and tangible, had returned. And so had he. Callie Wren entered the room with her usual calm step, holding a fresh set of linens over her arm. She approached the bed, expecting another quiet morning of routine care. But something stopped her instantly. Mason's eyes were open. For a full second she froze, unable to speak, the linens slipping from her hands and falling silently to the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, wondering if exhaustion had finally played a trick on her. But then Mason blinked too. "Mason," she whispered, voice trembling. She stepped closer, her eyes filling with a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief. "Can you hear me?" His gaze moved clumsily toward her. His pupils struggled to focus, but there was recognition, faint, fragile, but undeniably present. Callie covered her mouth with both hands. A soft, broken laugh escaped her, the kind that only appears when hope suddenly becomes real. "Oh my goodness, you're here. You're really here." She pressed the call button with shaking fingers, summoning the medical team while her other hand gently touched his forearm. "You've come back," she whispered. "I knew you would." In that moment, her devotion over the years found its meaning. Doctors rushed in, surrounding the bed with medical equipment and urgent instructions. They checked his vitals, flashed lights in his eyes, spoke to him slowly. Mason tried to follow their voices, but the world moved faster than his mind could process. Then, through the swirl of activity, he looked toward the one person whose voice felt steady and familiar. Callie. His lips parted. A faint sound escaped, scarcely more than a breath. "Wa-re." The word cracked apart, fragile from disuse. Callie leaned closer. "You're in a long-term care center, Mason. You've been asleep for a while." He swallowed with difficulty. His throat felt like sandpaper. Another word struggled forward. "It's... how... long?" Callie hesitated, her eyes softening. 10 years, she said gently. 10 years. Mason's eyes fluttered as the weight of that number pressed against his foggy thoughts. He exhaled slowly, the sound weak but full of quiet disbelief. His lips moved again, this time shaping a different word, one that slipped out instinctively without conscious thought. "Elisa." Callie's expression shifted, not with judgment, but with empathy. "You're safe," she whispered. "Just breathe. We'll take this slowly." His mind didn't return all at once. It came back in shards, jagged memories that pierced through the haze with startling clarity. The clink of a spoon stirring tea, a faint smile, the sweet, warm smell of honey, the taste of chamomile on his tongue. Then the dizziness, the sudden heaviness, the table slipping from his grasp, his knees hitting the floor. He remembered calling her name, soft, confused, pleading, "Elisa," and he remembered her stepping backward. Not toward him, away. His breathing hitched. His fingers twitched weakly beneath the blanket as another memory surfaced. A shadow standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway. Corbin. Watching. Waiting. Images came like flashes of lightning, her hand placing the cup in front of him, her eyes avoiding his as he fell, the cold tile against his cheek. Callie noticed the change in his expression. "Mason, are you all right?" He swallowed hard, the answer forming slowly. "I remember." The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of a truth he hadn't asked for, a truth that had waited 10 years to be spoken again. The moment the facility contacted Arlena Wyatt, she dropped everything. Papers scattered across her desk, a half-eaten lunch left abandoned, and sped to the center with tears clouding her vision. Her heart pounded the entire drive, fear and hope pushing against each other inside her chest. When she arrived, she burst through the doorway of Mason's room, breathless and shaking. For a moment she froze, gripping the frame as though afraid the sight would vanish if she moved too quickly. There he was, eyes open, breathing on his own, looking back at her with tired but aware expression. "Mason," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Oh, Mason." He turned his head slightly toward her. His muscles trembled from the effort, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Lena. She rushed to his bedside, taking his hand in both of hers. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she pressed her forehead to the back of his hand. "I knew you were still in there," she choked out. "I never gave up on you. Never." Mason closed his eyes briefly, not from exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of hearing a voice that had refused to let him fade into silence. As Mason regained small fragments of strength over the next few days, conversations grew clearer. He could sit upright for short periods, listen longer, ask questions. Some answers comforted him. Others carved new wounds. It was Arlena who finally told him the truth. She sat beside him, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on the blanket as she searched for the right words. "There's something you need to know," she began. Her voice shook despite her attempt to steady it. Mason watched her closely. "Go on." Arlena took a slow breath. "Elisa never visited you," she said softly. "Not once. She left after a few days. She sold your home, the workshop, everything. And she disappeared." The words struck him with a slow, crushing force. He stared at her, emotions muted but undeniably painful beneath the surface. "She didn't come even once?" he asked, needing confirmation. "No," Arlena whispered. She walked away, completely. Silence filled the room. Not angry silence, not despairing silence, just a stillness so heavy it pressed against both of them. Mason looked down at his hands, thinner, older, scarred by years of stillness. He exhaled, long and slow. "Then she made her choice," he said quietly. It wasn't rage. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. In the days that followed, nurses expected anger. They expected him to shout, break down, demand answers. But Mason did none of those things. He met each piece of truth with a calmness that surprised even him. When Kalia asked how he felt about Elisa's betrayal, he thought for a long moment before responding. "I'm done carrying pain for someone who didn't care whether I lived or died," he said softly. Kalia nodded, her expression respectful, not pitying. "You don't want revenge," she said gently. "Revenge?" Mason shook his head, the motion slow but steady. "No, that's not who I am. I want what's right, not what's violent." Arlena squeezed his hand. "Justice," she whispered. "Yes," he replied. "Justice." He didn't fantasize about hurting Elisa or Corbin. He didn't let hatred brew inside him. He simply understood that the truth needed to be faced, and that the people who chose cruelty needed to be held accountable. The calm in his voice carried a strength more powerful than any outburst. Mason Wyatt had awakened with a renewed purpose, not a desire for vengeance. His path forward was clear. This was not a story of destruction. It was a story of truth, healing, and the pursuit of justice. Recovery was nothing like the dramatic awakenings shown in movies. Mason's first attempts to move were painful, shaky, and humbling. His muscles had weakened from years of stillness. Even lifting a cup felt like lifting a weight. Physical therapists guided him through slow stretches, cautious steps, and exercises designed to spark life back into limbs that had forgotten their purpose. Every session left him exhausted, but he refused to quit. He gripped parallel bars with trembling hands, pushed through burning pain, and celebrated small victories, standing for 10 seconds, taking 3 steps without collapsing, raising his arms high enough to hug Arlena. These moments rebuilt him inch by inch. Kalia watched every milestone with gentle encouragement. She'd quietly say, "You're doing better than you think," whenever he grew frustrated. Mason found himself relying on her calm voice, her careful hands, and her unwavering belief in his progress. The facility hallways became his training ground, each step a reminder that he was reclaiming not only mobility, but control of a life stolen from him. Physical strength was one thing, emotional strength was another. Mason had lost a decade, his home, his marriage, his sense of safety. But with every conversation, Kalia helped him stitch together parts of himself he thought were gone. They talked during evening therapy, her childhood stories, his memories of Cedar Valley, how it felt to wake up and realize the world had kept turning without him. The more they spoke, the more Mason felt warmth where emptiness once sat. Kalia didn't push him, she simply listened. Their closeness grew naturally, hands brushing when she adjusted his walker, soft smiles exchanged during tough days, a steady presence in moments when grief threatened to overwhelm him. One afternoon, in the facility garden, Mason broke down. Frustration, sorrow, relief, everything collided. He whispered, "I lost everything." Kalia shook her head. "You didn't lose yourself, and that's the part that matters most." Her words settled deep inside him. From that day on, he felt something new stirring, hope. Not forced, not fragile, real hope. As his strength returned, Arlena brought him a box filled with everything she'd collected over 10 years, financial statements, old phone records, witness notes, reports about the sale of his house. She had quietly tracked every shred of information she could find. Mason spent days combing through it. Piece by piece, the story formed. Elisa selling the home, Corbin moving with her, their disappearance, the lies. The more he studied, the more one truth settled firmly. He needed answers, not to punish, not to hurt, but to finally understand. When Mason told Arlena he wanted to find them, she didn't hesitate. Kalia, too, asked to join. Mason paused before agreeing, not because he doubted her, but because he valued her safety. Still, the steadiness in her eyes convinced him she was ready. They packed lightly and began the journey. 3 people in a quiet car, traveling toward a past that needed closure. The road ahead carried tension, reflection, and an unmistakable sense of purpose. This wasn't a chase driven by anger. It was guided by truth. Corbin's business office sat on the edge of a busy district, but when he opened the door and saw Mason standing there, alive, upright, and unbroken, he looked as though the ground had vanished beneath him. His skin paled, his hands shook, fear washed across his face with startling clarity. "Mason, you were supposed to..." But the words died. Mason didn't yell,